and welcome to episode 2 of the Retro Critical Podcast. Now you might be saying to yourself, wait a minute, hold on, this is the Critical Strike podcast, isn't it? And it should be a monthly podcast, it shouldn't be a bi-weekly podcast. Well, very good questions. To address the first point, I had to change the name of the podcast because, and this is my own, idiocy at work, I happened to Google the Retro Critical, or the Critical Strike podcast, and there is another podcast out there with a very similar name. It's called Critical Strike, the Podcast. So at that point, it was clear that a name change was in order. This other podcast had been around for a couple of years. They have over 130 episodes, so I'm not going to challenge the name. I think Retro Critical has a nice sound to it as well. I should have, of course, looked at this sort of thing before releasing the first episode, but strangely I thought to myself, well, who's going to have Critical Strike in the name? I was thinking of the Fire Pro Wrestling, critical strikes that you could get with certain characters, plus I am innately a critical person. Sounded like it would work, but Retro Critical is fine. And the point about this being a monthly podcast, I still really want to make it a monthly podcast, but I am in a little bit of a bind. I mentioned on the last episode, and you'll hear me mention it in a few segments in this episode, that I'm building a new gaming PC. Well, I have built said PC, or I should have said I had it built. There's a whole story behind this that I'll get into. But I had decided to go for a full tower, because my older PC that I have here, which I did build, I went with a mid-tower, and I always found, I don't have enough room to work. It's really cramped in there, the airflow wasn't that great. So let me get another computer that is a full tower. And I'm not going to say that was a mistake, but boy did I underestimate how big this particular case is. It's the CM Striker, I think. CM Storm Striker, something like that. It's the big Cooler Master white Stormtrooper looking case, and it is wonderful. There's a lot to love about it, but it is huge. So now I'm actually sitting here as I record this intro between one fairly sized mid-tower and one absolutely monstrous full tower. I mean, the thing looks like almost a mini fridge. I've got wires all over the place. I've got 2 mice, 2 keyboards, the recording setup. I am just sort of leaning in to kind of get some room on the desk here to record. So it's very uncomfortable, it's very cramped, and I just cannot work like this until the end of the month and release the podcast. So I'm going to release this one a little bit early and see what happens, and then, in May I will, release another one. So the schedule's a little off, but anyway, just some quick thoughts about why I had the PC built rather than build it myself, and some reflections on the current state of PC gaming. I basically, after Christmas, decided slowly but surely I was going to build my new computer. It's been 5 years since the old one. I had one of the original Sandy Bridge, the first Sandy Bridge i7, I think it was a 2600K. One of the first Sandy Bridge motherboards, and it was a great computer. It lasted. I have a GTX 780 in there, and it was really good. But I said, eventually, time to upgrade. So I started to kind of purchase some stuff here or there, things that went on sale. It was not really Black Friday, but right in the whatever they call the Cyber Monday, President's Weekend, and I was just going to slowly accumulate this stuff and put it together when I had some time over the summer. If it was a good price, purchase some things. Well, I didn't get too far. I had the processor, and I hadn't decided on a motherboard. Had a power supply. I got some RAM. I was like, you should really get the RAM, I guess, after you have the motherboard, but it was just a good deal. So back, I guess, slightly before Easter, I was just browsing and I saw that a company called CyberPower PC was having a spring sale, so I clicked in, and basically the deal that they were offering was so good on a high, well, probably just mid-range computer, but you could upgrade to, I guess, the 6700K processor, which I guess is going to slowly be phased out in a couple of years. But anyway, it was just a good deal, and it turned out to be about $10 more than what I could have built this particular configuration for. So I said, let me order it, let me give it a shot. And I had my eye on this case anyway, so, they had the case. They had a pretty decent motherboard, and they just had a deal on everything, a number of different upgrades. So I wound up getting, like I said, the case, the 6700K, and kind of a mid-range MSI motherboard, DDR4, 16 megabytes of DDR4 RAM, I think 4,000, whatever it is, megahertz, upgraded cooler, upgraded lighting, 1,000-watt power supply, which was brand new, and they gave you a free upgrade to a 970, GTX 970 from, I think it's EVGA, with the upgraded cooler, and I guess it's super clocked or something like that. Plus, they gave you $100 off, $50 off the order, $50 in an American Express card, a copy of The Division, an upgraded warranty, reduction on the price of pro wiring. So everything really was like, at least let me get it, let me see what the quality is like, and if not, I could send it back. Well, I just got it, and it's good so far. I can't really review the thing because I'm just really starting to use it, but really, really nice looking machine. It's just so big, and I can't sit between both PCs anymore. But as I was unboxing this, and I've been re-downloading all of my Steam games, it occurred to me how far Windows has come as a platform, and how far, PC gaming has come. I think we're at a point now where we can really say, we are in a golden age of PC gaming, and of course people are going to say, well, of course not, that was back in the late 90s or earlier. People have that sort of emotional attachment to a particular time in PC gaming, but if you look at it, if you pull back a little bit, look at all that is being offered. I remember when I graduated college, I actually got a job with a software company, and they would have different presentations, and Microsoft came in one day and they said, we know, Windows XP is getting a little long in the tooth, we're not taking advantage of the hardware, Vista's gonna change everything. And of course, arguably that wasn't the case, and you had Windows 7, which is still my favorite version of Windows, and just, incrementally, the hardware has gotten more powerful, Windows has gotten better, and then you get to Steam, and Steam, to me, is an utter revelation. Now, I remember back, what was my first, the first memories I have playing PC games was on an old NEC that was purchased in 1990, and, just play the very, basic stuff, probably shareware or bootleg stuff that my father had gotten a hold of. Then in 1995, we got a Gateway 2000, and that was really one of the first systems where I was really playing a lot of games. I remember getting one of those little SNES-looking joypads where you could sort of screw in the joystick to the directional button. It was a Gravis, I think. And getting Mortal Kombat 3, getting a game called Imperialism, and just playing the heck out of those games. It was an absolutely terrific time. Then I got a laptop in the probably about 2000 that it was gaming capable, because I remember playing one of the early Civilization games. There was a Star Wars kind of Civ type game I was really into. The Jedi Knight series, the Kyle Katarn games, the later ones of those I was playing. But, it was always less... I don't know, it was always less enjoyable to me than console gaming, quite frankly, because you had compatibility issues. And then around the time that I actually sort of modded my desktop PC, and really in 2006, 2007, and mostly for emulation, but then I eventually upgraded it. I put in, I think, 8 gigabytes of RAM. I had some NVIDIA card, and I started to get into PC gaming. And I remember, this was in the early days of Steam, but I remember, going to the stores, getting the PC games in the boxes, going through multi-disc installations, and something would always go wrong. There was always an issue. There was still the compatibility bug. There was just a lot that you had to sort of work through to get the game just the way you wanted it. And of course, there was no centralized interface to run all of your games and to keep them updated and to keep your drivers updated and stuff like that. So I remember getting a couple games that just wouldn't work for whatever reason. One was the X3, the sort of space adventure game. The other was, believe it or not, NBA 2K10. And what was the third? Was it Fallout 3? Anyway, I did have Fallout 3, but I can't remember. It was definitely NBA 2K10 and this X3 game. I think it was the second one in the, I guess, later series, if you want to call it that. So I had a friend who came over, and he was big into torrents and Pirate Bay and everything. He's like, oh, just download the cracked version. And I remember saying, oh, okay, I'll give it a shot. So I got the cracked version of these two games, and they worked flawlessly. And I thought, this is what, I bought these games, and yet I'm still, pirating the cracked versions to actually get them to run. And really the cracked versions were just better, at least for those two games, than what came out of the box, at least for the configuration that I was running. So we've come such a long way, and I've always said that if you want to combat piracy, and I think this is what Steam is doing. I mean, think about all the terrible DRM that you had to deal with. Tages, I remember, on that Butcher Bay game. There was, it's funny, everyone was in an uproar about whatever the DRM thing that EA was running, where if you changed your RAM, if you changed your graphics card, you could only make a few different system configurations, and then it would lock you out of your game. I think the first Crisis game had this, and I'm totally blanking on the name, but everyone hated this for a couple of years. And then in comes Steam, and yes, Steam is a form of DRM, but what it does is it fundamentally competes with the pirated version. Steam is easier to use. Steam is more seamless. Steam just gives you a ton of value for the relatively low prices you're paying for the game. And as a result, I went from getting the discs, getting the cracked versions on occasion, to, from, I would say, 2012 until now, just buying a lot of games on Steam, because they have the great prices. Steam is competing with, it's the one digital platform, you could argue, that really has consistently terrific pricing. You click in there, every weekend there's something new. And it takes me back to actually the NES era, in the sense that you had this new system, you had this great platform, and it seemed like there was limitless possibility. I remember going to Toys R Us, or I mentioned this in my game rental video. There was a Blockbuster back in the days when Blockbuster was something special, and they had 3 rows of NES games that you could rent. And it seemed like every weekend there was something new to discover. Well, I think that's the way it is with Steam. There's so many just interesting games to discover at low prices. You can build this incredible library, go through that library at your leisure. It's wonderful. I couldn't have imagined that we would get to this point of ease and kind of seamless usability in PC gaming. And I mean, I remember a friend back in the, I would say 97, 98, he was a PC gamer, and just the frustration that he would go through and the upgrades he would have to make to eke out just a little bit more performance on his machine. And now, obviously, the Intel, the i5, i7 line of processors, so much power for a reasonable price. The NVIDIA cards are just offering really terrific performance and power draw and low heat levels and stuff like that. Obviously, some people are going to argue that they're overpriced, but whatever the case might be, the performance per dollar is incredible now compared to what it was when I started tinkering around with modding some of my old PCs to get them somewhat gaming ready. It's an incredible experience. So, as critical as I am of modern gaming, I'd have to say that the platform that I feel now most loyal to is PC gaming, even if, and I still feel like ideally I want to be sitting on the couch with a controller in my hand. That's how I grew up. That's the kind of gamer that I was for so many years. I've always seen PC gaming as this wonderful kind of secondary path in the hobby, but just the incredible hardware performance, the ease of upgradability. I mean, now it's just, especially with these cases, just plug in a hard drive and go, stick in a graphics card, very easy to SLI things. Everything has become just so accessible with PC gaming. And like I said, with the whole issue of VR and the upgrades that you're going to have to make to the PlayStation, to the Xbox One, I think I'm just going to stick with the PC now. I have this new PC. It seems to be working well, at least in the first couple of days. And I think we're going to look back on this time in PC gaming. I mean, I hope it doesn't end. I hope, Steam carries forward with just the same service and value that they've given us for the past, I would say, they're really kicking in the past 5 years. I hope it continues, but at some point, if the landscape changes, I think we're going to look back at the period 2011, 2012 to 2016 or 17 or whenever we have that next change and say, this really was a hallmark moment in PC gaming. And if you haven't explored Steam, if you haven't really gotten in to modding your PC or building a gaming PC, do it. And if price is an issue, and of course for a lot of us it is, just wait for the deal to happen. I was looking actually for my father around Christmas. He wanted a new PC, so I was looking on Cyber Power PC, and the Black Friday deals weren't so great. And so that's why I initially said, okay, well, I'm just going to start gathering some parts here and there, and I'll build it in the summer. But you just have to be persistent, look at the sales, and eventually something will crop up. Same goes for the components. Newegg, B&H Photo. Let's see, what is the other one? I've had luck with Tiger Direct, although I don't know if they're still in business. But just wait, be patient, collect your stuff within obviously within the return period of, in case these things don't work, and just enjoy all that PC gaming has to offer. So this story made the rounds in the month of April, and that was the 24 karat gold analog NT, which is on sale for $5,000 from Analog NT. It's a French company. If you're not familiar with the Analog NT, it is a very high-end Nintendo Entertainment System. It came out about a couple years ago. And, basically what you have with this is kind of an RGB NES, with the RGB built in. If I remember correctly from the initial stories leading up to its release, it was actually using Nintendo parts with a custom enclosure and a slot for a Famicom cartridge and an NES cartridge. Also does some really high-end HDMI up-converting. So it was, the definitive NES experience, or at least it purported to be that. Well, what they've done now is they've come out with this 10-console run where it is covered in 24-karat gold. And, what to make of a product like this? The regular Analog NT, I was looking at that, and I could almost, which was $500, by the way, I could almost rationalize buying that. If you are a passionate Nintendo Entertainment System collector and you want, the highest end RGB experience, and the people who've reviewed, it's reviewed really well. It really is a luxury NES. I can almost see it. I don't think that, high-end components are necessary, but, as a tech enthusiast and as a collector of various types of physical media, I do recognize that, there is, or there are circumstances, there is a point where you say to yourself, I would like a high-end component. And, there are, in today's market, very few, truly high-end components. So, at $500, it is very expensive. I can get it for the small niche collector to which the original Analog NT was appealing. But at $5,000, you have to wonder where this hobby is going and what is the ceiling for high end. I think it's still being established, but $5,000 is pretty steep. And, does this have any value? Well, of course it's supposed to celebrate the 30th anniversary of The Legend of Zelda, and I believe it is meant to actually ship with the gold Zelda cart. It is, and that's not 14-karat gold. They're just going to give you, an original Zelda cart that had kind of the gold paint on it. But what is the end game here with the Analog NT 24-karat gold edition? Is it a good investment even from the standpoint of gold? So actually I figured, let me look at the gold price. Now it doesn't say how much, what actually weight gold you're getting, at least not that I found on their website, but as of the date that I'm recording this segment, gold is $1,236.26 an ounce, and it's been above $1,200 for a few months now. So hopefully that'll be the case when you listen to this in May. But just say for the sake of argument, it's $1,200. So you're getting, are you getting 4 ounces of gold? We don't know, or about 4 ounces of gold. And is it, in itself a good gold investment? I don't think so. To have, and I'm not an expert on gold, but, there's some, kind of standard knowledge out there if you're buying gold. You want to buy gold at or about the spot price, and you want to buy it in a form that you can easily sell to someone, and that person could easily melt it down. And my guess is, if it's gold-plated, how do they get the gold plating off? Could you just, in a time of crisis, sell your gold NES and put food on the table for your family in the post-apocalyptic future? I don't think that's the case, so it's not a good gold investment. We don't know how much gold you're getting. It seems like the ultimate cosmetic upgrade that adds no real value to the product. What I think would have been great is if they re-released the Analog NT, with, the original Analog NT with, kind of a fake gold look and maybe a Zelda emblem. I guess they can't do that because I have to contact Nintendo. But, that would have been nice, because I think, I do think it's a good console, and I think the Analog people, they also do like a consoleized MVS. So continue the good work of providing these high-end enthusiast units, but you don't need to go overboard. And, what's the next? What's the next high-end item for the niche retro collector? If it's not the $5,000 gold-plated Nintendo, we're going to have a platinum Genesis. I mean, what's, and you have to wonder, are we at that point, a collector? Are we, a member of a retro community, or are we just someone engaging in insane, conspicuous consumption just because we can? So it'll be interesting to see how many people buy this. Again, there are only 10. Who buys it? Who reviews it? I think it'll say something about the community. Next up, I want to address a topic that I've been thinking about for a long time, and under other circumstances, I would probably kind of sit down and really research this topic and come up with a whole bunch of different examples and analyze different games. But since I don't really have the time to do that, I thought I would just kind of briefly run down this idea and see what you guys think of it. I've thought for a while about the question of inequality in games as a kind of a new structural principle that we've seen introduced over the past 3 to 4 years. So what do I mean by structural inequality? I think in order to kind of define that, we have to look at functional inequality, and functional inequality has been around in gaming for an incredibly long time. Basically, functional inequality is a design choice. It is a design choice that we've seen in arcade games of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and then bleeding into console games. Functional inequality, as I'm putting it here, is a way to basically increase the profitability of a game by pitting players of different skill levels against each other indirectly. So, think back to Street Fighter 2 in the arcade, as an example of this. Of course, you can, basically manipulate, or the arcade owner could manipulate the game to increase, with dip switches and whatnot, to increase coin in. And of course, you were so attracted to the game, the beauty of the graphics, the innovative new playstyle, and you put your quarter in, or you put your 50 cents in, and maybe you, in the single-player mode, could only get through one match, or you couldn't even get through one match, and you see another player come, and he can get through 2 or 3, or, if you played against that other player, and he had some more experience, or you just played the game for longer, again, that inequality of skill was a way to get you to throw more money in, to reach the level where you could get 1 or 2 or 3 games out of a quarter. And that's the way it was. It doesn't have to be a 2-player arcade game. I mean, think about shoot-em-ups in the arcade. Think about basically any arcade game that you've played and how difficult they were. We kind of overlook that now when we play on MAME or compilations where you can adjust the difficulty. And of course, this bled over into console gaming, and at least with console gaming in the early days, talking about the NES, SNES, Genesis, things like that, game difficulty and structural inequality in the sense that you're putting the game at a level of difficulty that is unequal to the majority of your player base, was an attempt to increase value by making you simply play the game longer. And think about what happened back in the day if you actually, got really good at a game and memorized a pattern. The Mega Man game that you were struggling with for months might now only take you 30 or 40 minutes. Arguably that was useful because structural or functional inequality was built in to the price of the game, whether it was the coin in the arcade or the 50 or 60 bucks that you were paying for the NES cartridge. It gave you a set amount of enjoyment per dollar. And, the whole concept of video game death, of course, was the sort of narrative or mechanical manifestation of that principle. And so we just sort of grew to accept it, but it was largely useful. Now, certain games were too hard, certain games were too easy, but in order for a game to be successful, I would say up until 1998, 1999, it had to, be a little bit more difficult than your skill level. It had to increase its difficulty to keep you playing. So you've thought to yourself, well, the money that I spent on this or the birthday gift opportunity that I took to get this game was worth it. So structural inequality is fundamentally different. Structural inequality is, for all intents and purposes, monetization. And you get the sense that games are kind of asking themselves, or developers are asking themselves, how can a game experience be manipulated to encourage participation in a microtransaction scheme? And for a long time here on this channel, I have said that that is frequently posed in a trade-off between time versus money, and I've called this the fundamental parasitism of the freemium gaming model. And so, you can play this game for free and just devote hours upon hours upon hours of your time to it in order to unlock certain items or get currency to be competitive, either in the multiplayer game or to experience the full content of the game, or if you can't afford to waste your time in that way or devote your time in that way, well, of course you can pay money to unlock the content that you would otherwise need to grind for. It's a parasitic practice because, if you're, I was going to say over the age of 18, but even if you're a high school kid, time is a very valuable commodity, and to what degree should you be devoting it to a game that is structured to absorb so much of your time that it forces you to pay money to unlock certain things. So, I am not a developer, so I don't know if game design starts off with these kind of considerations of microtransaction schemes or microeconomies, and then they build a game around it, or do they still, focus on building a good game and then figure out how to monetize it afterwards? I would imagine that it starts off with a couple monetization goals and moves from there. And I think the tragic thing in all of this is that a lot of these games are really good. I've said for years now that Hearthstone is a wonderful game. Hearthstone is a brilliant game. It's, I think one of the best games to be released in the past 10 or 15 years. Because of its, mixture of tactics and luck and strategy. Wonderful game. Even Candy Crush is a good, match 3 game. But the reason why I certainly stopped playing Hearthstone was that, again, I didn't want to find myself in this tug-of-war between time and money. I couldn't invest the time to really keep up with the different packs and different, expansions with the robots and everything like that. Nor did I want to invest the money to keep me, competitive. And I think that's one of the things that you see with this free-to-play model is that human against human competition is, fuels this time versus money conundrum in which you find yourself. If you really want to play this game competitively and if you want to follow the community and understand the changes in the metagame, then you're going to have to cough up a lot of time or a lot of money. And of course, much like the arcade days, this has bled into console gaming, where you see full-price titles create these microeconomies and create these and institute these microtransaction schemes. Think, of course, about Street Fighter V, an example about which I've been very vocal. Street Fighter V was a $60 release that was essentially a freemium game. But again, it follows that pattern. Street Fighter V mechanically is a wonderful game, but the scheme that they have in place is particularly nefarious, especially if they don't offer an arcade mode, because then you cannot even have the typical Street Fighter experience without going online, playing people who are significantly better than you, and kind of forcing you, if you want the next character, or if you want the next costume, or if you want, a buff, I could see them adding that, then you're going to have to pay some money to be competitive. You see it in sports games. It's basically even made its way into first-person shooters with, the different map packs. If you want to keep up with the community there, then you're going to have to buy those $20 release map packs, or just get the season pass, and so forth. So, what is the larger picture here? And this is, I've kind of came to this, especially after the Street Fighter debacle, I kind of came to the realization that I think splitting the player bases in this way, and again, we're even seeing it with the PlayStation 4.5, Xbox upgrade, whatever that's going to be called. You're splitting players into these different classes, and you're actually creating, I think, a kind of class envy, and that's of course fueled by social media and streaming, where you have a top 1% of players who get the audience, who get the sponsorship deals, and then we all watch and kind of try to learn from them. So in a very strange way, I think games now are kind of mirroring the socioeconomic inequality that exists in larger society. Now, if you scoff at that, I would suggest that you take a look at any sort of recent set of economic data about it, income inequality in the United States, or simply look around you. And I think that the fact that, at least in this country, social and economic inequality are extraordinarily high is something that you can discover, once you open your eyes to it. If you don't agree with me, if you think that's overly political, I'm not going to address that here, but anyway, any number of studies have kind of pointed that out. But I think it's curious that games are starting to mirror that, where you have this stratification of players based on economic asymmetry between them. Even if, in the case of free-to-play games, certain players can afford to devote the extra time to unlocking the items and skills and whatever they need to be good. And again, it's kind of perverse that gaming is becoming a reflection of that asymmetry in which we all live. Previously, back in the days of functional inequality, games were, I think, a site of fantasy. They were a site of escape. You didn't have to worry about economic considerations, and you can set yourself off into this world of power fantasies, or just simply, fantasy, sci-fi fantasy, and go off. And you think of the case of a Japanese RPG, that was a very intricate, numerical set that you were essentially manipulating to move forward in the game by gaining more experience, more magic, and so forth. And so while you had to grind, the grind was part of the fun, because with each hour that you ground out experience points in the game, that went to progressing your character. It made the game easier, it progressed the narrative, and it was under your control. It was a kind of a numerical economy that was under your control. And I think that's one of the kind of less discussed reasons about, why some people love the traditional JRPG, because it was, you were staring down at the screen, you had this little world in your hands, and it was a world, however challenging or however time-intensive it might have been, it was a world that you could fundamentally control and manipulate, and that is, a subtle but very real power fantasy in those games. And it was something into which you could absorb yourself. I think now you are beholden to, an external kind of economy in which you're trapped, in which you're competing with other players, not even for ranking, but also for enjoyment. And who is ultimately pulling the strings to all of this? In many cases, it is a heartless multinational corporation. I think it's a very, very sad state of affairs in gaming. And I hope that there's some pushback against this idea of inequality being a structural principle. But since this strategy is so profitable, I doubt we will be moving away from this reality anytime soon. Well, it's the day after Wrestlemania, and obviously you guys aren't going to hear this for a while, but I am distraught. I am completely and utterly disgusted by the show, and I had very, very low hopes for Wrestlemania. I'm not going to go through my whole problem with the current WWE. I went through that in a video called An Open Letter to the WWE. But anyway, I watch 3, perhaps 4 shows a year. Rumble, Mania, and SummerSlam, and occasionally Survivor Series. And I get together with a friend of mine, and that's just what we do. It's 3 or 4 nights a year that we can get together. And so it's more of a social thing. We don't follow the product. But, it's WrestleMania, right? So you don't need to follow the product to enjoy the show. When I went onto Wikipedia and just happened a week ago to look at the card, I said, wow, this card, quite frankly, sucks. And it was funny, I went over to Squared Circle subreddit, and, I just posted a little message. I said, I think this is the weakest card in years, but I haven't been following the show. Can you guys... give me a reason to be excited. Have I missed something? And they all got back to me like, oh, it's not our job to get you excited. Piss off. You're so fucking negative. Blah, blah, blah. And, they're very, very touchy for, a website that, predominates in cat memes. Okay? These guys, just trying to have a discussion. Anyway, so we watched the show, and, first of all, it's so long. It was, 6 hours. Just absolutely brutally bad booking. Of course, there was no heat going into the card, so you didn't, care about these matches. But so many missed opportunities, and it was so painfully obvious that this company is completely out of touch with its fan base and is doing whatever it wants, whatever it believes is quote-unquote best for business, that whole nonsense. And, in my video, I argued that WWE is no longer a wrestling promotion. They are a purveyor of content. And that's exactly what this WrestleMania was. It was, you have the brand WrestleMania, you have a certain set of expectations as to the staging of it, and those spots that you'll see. And they just sort of threw it all in a blender, and there you go. That's WrestleMania. So, I'm not going to run through every match, but, a couple of things that were, puzzling and or outright terrible. So you start off with the ladder match, which is a throwaway spot fest, I get it, but this year you had a little bit of intrigue. You had Kevin Owens, you had Sami Zayn coming up, so you figure, give the belt to one of those two guys, and then, set up a rivalry. Well, that didn't happen. It went to Zack Ryder, who I didn't even realize was still with the company. Then you have the AJ Styles Jericho match, and surely AJ Styles was going to win because he was over, and it's WrestleMania. Why not set him up as a top babyface? But of course, he had to lose to Jericho because, well, we don't want a strong babyface. We want to put over Reigns. And it's WrestleMania, and we can't have a TNA guy go over. All right, so then you skip ahead. The New Day, I despise the New Day. They are one of the most despicably racist acts I have ever seen. Now, they're over, they're popular, they're connecting with the fans. That doesn't mean that it's not fundamentally racist. Bad, insensitive, stereotypical characters and angles have done amazingly well and were amazingly popular and over with the fans. I mean, you had the whole Snuka thing with the coconut. You had every time Tito Santana would wrestle, there would be bad, Mexican jokes. Obviously, the Attitude Era really sexualized women when it was really popular, and not to mention the kissing Vince's ass and all of that, garbage. The yoga thing between Triple H and Trish Stratus. Just so many things that were in bad taste, but yeah, that was really, really popular with the fans. Here you have just stereotypical behavior from these guys. I mean, dancing and prancing around like the proverbial house Negroes, for our amusement. It is deplorable, and I wish, and they're, to me, you've squandered, real opportunities with these guys, with Kofi Kingston and Big E, and I don't know who the other guy is, but he can talk pretty well. So, individually these guys could be really good, but this is a joke of a team. And as soon as they came on, cell phones came out. Totally disconnected with the show. Then you have the women's match, and I guess they're trying to really make it politically incorrect to criticize the women because, now they're raising them to the same status as men. They're no longer divas. But, by the way, when they were coming down to the ring, it was like a fashion show. Oh, Charlotte's robe is made out of a robe that Ric Flair wore to, Starrcade 81, some nonsense like that. Oh, and how did Charlotte go over? But it was a man's interference. So, terrible and, booking on that. And then, of course, the actual action. These women are fair. They're not that great in the ring, and you can give them all the time in the world. They're poor wrestlers, and they have poor angles and rivalries. I hate to run down the women. I believe the women do deserve a shot on the card, and I'd like to see great women's wrestling. But when you look at the history of the business, I mean, when did you have great women's wrestling? I would argue that from the standpoint of, fan interest and getting characters over, the whole Trish Stratus, Lita, and those other people around between, 2001 and 2004, they really improved in the ring. They had a lot of interesting moves, and they had interesting angles, again, if not a little over-sexualized. And then, of course, you have the Japanese women of the late 90s. And while I didn't see too many matches from that era, the one thing that I did take away when I saw Toyota and Suzuki and all those women wrestlers is that they had a style and a pace and a set of moves that was significantly different than the men. You were seeing a different product, and it was an exciting product, and they were using their high-flying ability, their speed, their flexibility to do really incredible things. So when you watched, a match from that era, and with those talents, you were not like, oh, well, boy, that's a botched man spot. It was a type of action that you could only see with the women, and that's the direction I think they should move in, and really dispense with the WWE types of spots and near falls and stuff like that. Let them be creative and do something different, and then maybe it'll be good. But, that was a throwaway match. It was a throwaway match. A lot of people say it's the best match on the show, but it wasn't that engrossing, in my opinion. Then you had the Shane McMahon Undertaker match, which, it was just god-awful. And, why was this match even booked? It was slow, it was plotting. And then, of course, you have the big spot, and I just have to say, having watched the pay-per-view live where Owen Hart fell to his death, and even before that, but certainly that, sticks in my mind as just, it's unnecessary, okay? You could have had the same angle, you could have had the same bad match and table spots and, weapon usage, but Shane McMahon did not need to dive 15 or 20 feet onto his back through a table. As a wrestling fan, I don't want to see that. Was it cool? Was it memorable? Yes, but if the match is so weak that you have to come up with a literally death-defying spot to get the match over, then why have the match? You could have had that angle where, Shane was in one corner and Vince was in the other, and it could have been The Undertaker against Strowman with a lot of interference and stuff like that, and you could have had, cut it down to 14, 15 minutes. It could have been an acceptable attraction match. But as it stood, will everyone remember it? Of course everyone will remember it, but it was totally unnecessary. Battle Royal, hey, it was good to see Tatanka. That's all I can say about that. And then the main event, which, just was an indictment. You had Stephanie McMahon getting up there and, trying to get the fans to not want to be sheep and, go against the authority and all of that, reminiscent of whatever, 1984. Some people said Mad Max. I've never seen Mad Max. The Apple commercial from, that played off in 1984. All trying us to get to hate them so much that, we would all side with Roman Reigns. Obviously, that wasn't going to work. And it was one of the worst promos I've ever seen. It was so bad. The match itself was boring. Roman Reigns, and again, I don't watch every week. I don't watch the other pay-per-views or Raw, but any time that I've seen him, he seems to have three moves: a spear, a punch, and a clothesline, and maybe, a kick here or there. Horribly long. It didn't need to be another half-hour match. Completely turned me off to the company. And it wasn't like I was going to stick around after WrestleMania anyway, but, my friend and I said, do we really want to do this? Do we really want to, watch this? And we say that a lot. We always wind up doing it out of tradition, and just sort of works in our schedules as a time to meet, on the calendar year. But this is why this show epitomized everything I hate about modern wrestling. And, it was the worst it was the worst main event that I have seen, I believe. Maybe I'd have to go back and watch WrestleMania 2. It was possibly the worst WrestleMania. It was one of the worst WWE events, that I've seen. And, I was at the 95 King of the Ring, which was pretty god-awful. But, what can I say? This is a product that is pushing its fan base away. And if ever there was a need for real competition, it is now. And of course, NXT is the real competition, right? Well, the sad thing is, NXT, for as great, and they had a great show at that Dallas show the Friday before WrestleMania. Terrific stuff. But I get the sense that, okay, we're going to create this other brand because we have all this talent that we really don't want to put over on the main show. We really don't want to fundamentally change our company with this roster of amazing people who have main evented all over the world. So we'll stick them there, and we'll stick them in rivalries, and we'll kind of play to the IWC and the Smarks, and then we'll bring them up and, use them in the mid-card and trade victories, with those guys and Chris Jericho or whomever else. Awful show. One of the worst wrestling shows of all time. I'm almost embarrassed that, I spent, I didn't watch it for 6 hours because I didn't watch the pre-show, but from 7 to 11 or 11:30, that it was an absolute waste of time. Well, I want to get something off my chest here. I follow a guy on YouTube. His channel is called Otaku No Video, and he is an anime analyst and commentator. And I'm not the biggest anime fan, but He's a nice enough guy, and his presentation is interesting, and I have nothing to contribute. He does like a weekly sort of live stream, and I can't really contribute anything, to the comments. But he's a good, thorough, analytical presenter of his information. I appreciate that because I don't think there are enough people like that on YouTube. But he had a show a couple weeks back now, and the topic was, at what point does criticizing anime or does criticizing a cultural product kind of reduce and impede the enjoyment of other fans of that product, and should we self-censor our critique of something to protect the feelings of other people? And he came down on the side of saying, yes, we need to do this. Just because you may emphatically dislike something and cast a value judgment upon it doesn't mean that you have the right to express that opinion in a forum where that opinion could insult or hurt someone's feelings who is particularly attached to this product. And I really took that the wrong way. Now, I didn't catch that on his live stream. I actually would have contributed something here. But it's an argument that I'm seeing more and more kind of creep in, not just to gaming, not just to anime or movies, but just to the culture in general. This idea that we have to censor ourselves and censor our opinions for the sake of being polite. And I think this is one of the most detrimental things that you can do. And I say that not because, I'm hosting a podcast with critical in the title, but simply, to say that democracy itself, and why are you talking about this anime, video games, where are you coming to democracy? But think about it for a minute. Democracy itself has always been, in large part, about people exchanging ideas with each other, even if those ideas were uncomfortable. And I think it's dangerous to suddenly say, well, even though your opinion of something is uncomfortable, even if since your opinion may make someone uncomfortable, even if it's what you truly believe, you should censor yourself. Totally outrageous position to take. And I think, obviously, and I don't know what the deal is with the anime community. I personally hate modern anime, and at some point I might go into why. But anything that I've seen today, I hate the digital artwork. I hate the goofy, cute girl, whatever they want to call it, slice of life bullshit. I despise it, and that's not an insult to people who like it. It just doesn't work for me. And if I were going to lay out my argument as to why, I would give reasons and historical comparisons with older anime and comparisons with other works of film. And I would try to, flesh out that opinion. And if you disagree with me, then so be it. But you should have the intellectual courage to confront opinions that differ from your own. And I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. And you'll see this coming up on this show. I'm a fan of professional wrestling. I've always been a fan of professional wrestling. And let's face it, from an outside objective perspective, you can criticize professional wrestling for any number of things. It tells stories horribly. It's campy. The state of it now is abysmal. It's been racist. It's been sexist. It is nothing other than a glorified carnival act. You can keep those insults coming, and I agree with some of those things. And you're not affecting my enjoyment of when I fire up the WWE Network and watch an episode of Saturday Night's Main Event from my childhood. I mean, yeah, if you walk into the room, you're like, what the hell is this? This is absolutely awful. Yeah, but I still like it. I don't understand the idea that there are people who are, I guess, very sensitive nowadays, and the slightest criticism is an affront to their sensibilities, and you can bear in mind, the argument in this video was that it is emotionally damaging. It is emotionally damaging to these people, so it's no longer a question of being quote unquote negative, but you're emotionally harming these people. I don't know if it's a deal with kids today. You can't criticize kids, or you can't criticize what kids like. If it's an issue of identity politics or something like that, let me know. Comment or tweet or whatever, and let me know if that's the case. But this overall sensitivity is really shocking, because when you criticize anything, and we'll keep it here to a game or a movie, these things exist in culture. These things are embedded in culture. In some instances, they can be politicized or are themselves political, and are therefore, I think, open to rational debate and discussion. In the last episode of the podcast, I talked about the whole idea of censoring, censoring Japanese games where, a female character is over-sexualized and things like that. That's a public debate. I shouldn't, I'm not, well, I love Street Fighter, and I want, our Mika to be exactly like she is in Japan, so when you censor her, when you critique Street Fighter for, having the goofy ass slap animation, you're upsetting me. Oh, I'm now emotionally hurt because of your opinion. No, that's insane. These things need to be discussed, and you need to come to a cultural and social consensus as to what is acceptable. And you can have disagreements about that. You should be able to, have that discussion in the open, whether it is, in a kind of a broad forum like the Gamergate stuff, or whether it's, in a literal small forum of fans online. You should be able to intelligently critique anything, and you shouldn't, actually, I believe you shouldn't have regard for people's feelings. Because criticism itself, it's an act in some cases of dissent. It's an act of courage. It is something that, it's an approach that we should really take to life itself. You have to, really question what's presented to you. You have to, vigorously analyze not just cultural products, but your own behaviors, the behaviors of others. It just is part of a vibrant democracy. Now, I'm not saying that, you should critique something with the intent in your critique of damaging someone's reputation. You like Dragon Quest. Well, anyone who likes Dragon Quest is, a Holocaust denier. We all know that. I mean, obviously that kind of thing should be frowned upon, and I think would be frowned upon easily. I think I don't think anyone is out there defending that type of onslaught, but we should not silence our voices in, really debating, analyzing, and critiquing works of art for fear that we'll make other people uncomfortable. It's, quite frankly, an absurd position. Now, a lot of the times on gaming podcasts and YouTube channels, people will say, "Oh, I got to talk about a story that just won't die," and it's kind of an annoying refrain. But I am kind of find myself in that position where, in the month of April, the whole Gamergate issue resurfaced again, and this time centering around Alison Rapp, the Nintendo employee who lost her job after she was the target of a very focused online smear campaign relating to her supposed role in getting the localizations of, Xenoblade Chronicles and Fire Emblem changed. I don't quite know what she was meant to be responsible for in Fire Emblem, but I know in the Xenoblade Chronicles, I think, she was rumored to have had a role in removing the cleavage size slider that you apparently got in Japan when you created your character, even though, of course, she said she actually liked that and she didn't have any role to play in the localization somehow, in some way. And this is the kind of murky area of the story, because I guess I haven't followed it since it's played out, but I don't know what initially caused people to think that she was involved in the localization or responsible for these changes, other than the fact that she apparently is an active feminist online, something like that. So, I talked about, I kind of addressed that on the first podcast, just with regard to censorship. Is, it right to censor a game? And you can go back and listen to the opinion there. But, new information has emerged. One of the questions that we had was, well, okay, she was working a second job, and that is why Nintendo fired her after a period of uncomfortable silence on their part with regard to the attacks that she was receiving. Naturally asked, what was that second job? So allegedly, the second job was that she was working as a high-priced escort in the Seattle area. And, this is a story that made it, even into the mainstream media, the Washington Post and stuff like that. According to the Washington Post, they argued or claimed that there is a group, not just in gaming, but in other sort of corners of the internet, groups of people, I should say, who engage in something called opponent research. Opponent research being kind of an orchestrated attempt to dig into the private lives of public figures in an attempt to hold them accountable for, past wrongdoing. Now, the question, I think this is a more than a fair question, is to what degree is Alison Rapp a public figure? And, I would say just because she worked at Nintendo, and I don't know what she did, she was in marketing or something, that doesn't make her a public figure. Nonetheless, she was a very, very open target for these people. Now, what they did was they went on to some site where you can find escorts, and they found pictures of someone who looked like her, albeit you couldn't see the person's face. But then they somehow dug into the picture file and matched, there's some sort of metadata for serial numbers. So they matched the serial number of the camera used to take the escort photo with the serial number that was embedded in some photos I guess she uploaded to Twitter or stuff like that. And that was allegedly, or possibly, the straw that broke the camel's back at Nintendo. Now, of course, the other things that they dug up, and this was, also related to this, was that she had somewhere published an undergraduate thesis in which she argued for cultural tolerance and understanding with regard to the portrayal of young sexualized girls in Japanese media, and just basically saying that, we should not impose Western values. But, she has some wording in there that, it's an undergraduate essay, but it's wording that I perhaps would not use. And I'm going to try to find it here. I would not want that to be out there. She writes in this essay, criminalizing, this is a quote, criminalizing the possession of a type of media, whether violent video games, controversial political or religious texts, or child pornography, is tantamount to criminalizing thought, and should be above countries like the U.S. and Japan, who have such strong freedom of speech protections. You can see where that's problematic, by the way, close quote. Perhaps the better wording should be, sexually explicit material, and then she could go on to, talk about her opinion there with more nuance. It's an undergraduate essay. If you look at some of the stuff that I wrote as an undergraduate, which is not published online, you won't find anything to do with, child pornography or any other kind of illegal activity, but you'll find, ill-considered, grandiose, perhaps bombastic assertions that, I wouldn't necessarily stand by today. Undergraduate writing is, it's still a developmental piece of writing. You're finding your voice, you're honing your analytical abilities. It's not, as if she published this essay at 40 and kind of tried to defend this position in this way. So, they dug that up. Apparently, they somehow doxed her and her family and stuff like that. So it's, obviously fundamentally reprehensible. Now, I'm going to look at it from a variety of different perspectives. I'm going to start with Nintendo itself to get it out of the way. And I'll say that, in today's modern corporate world, particularly when the focus of so much ire is on a supposed injustice, or in this case, I think a real injustice regarding Alison Rapp, that they would, not say anything and then come out and fire her. I hate to say it, but I think that is a suggestion that there is something behind it. Something about whatever her other job was, at the very least was, quote, inconsistent with our corporate values. And it would have to be strong enough where they weren't going to fear any kind of lawsuit. Now, it could be, of course, that they're just, myopic and stupid, and I'm not, I wouldn't rule that out, but, Nintendo is a very cold and calculating and very, very conservative company, and I don't think they, would just fire her. Oh, we don't like the fact that she's, on social media and saying stuff, she's fired. I think that at the very least there had to be, something, that they could find, contractual that would be grounds for dismissal. That's not to say that the woman is an escort, but I think, Nintendo or any sort of corporation in that situation isn't going to, set themselves up for, at worst a lawsuit or at most tons and tons of negative publicity. And, I think if you look at there's not a lot, at least in what I'm reading in these various articles, there's not a lot of backlash against Nintendo. So if their strategy was to avoid backlash, I think they're succeeding. If their strategy is to avoid a lawsuit, who knows, they're succeeding for the moment. And Rapp herself, neither confirmed nor denied that she was in fact, this escort. So, again, it doesn't exonerate Nintendo. It doesn't say that Nintendo did the right thing in this instance. But as much as I hate to admit it, their behavior, is a factor in kind of figuring out what's going on. Now, on to Rapp. I see that, first of all, before I even get into it, just because you express a political opinion online does not mean that you should be the target of, just deplorable harassment. It doesn't mean that your family should be threatened, and it really doesn't mean that you should lose your job. I think that this, what shall we call it, this corporate climate in which they want to distance themselves from anything possibly controversial is ultimately impinging on our free speech, because, ultimately you get to a point, well, what can I say? Can I say this? Can I write that? Where does, where do we draw the line between my capacity as a private, engaged citizen in democracy versus my, role in a corporation? So, I think that, then accusing her of being a social justice warrior, if you listen to the first episode, my opinion on even the use of the term social justice warrior. So I think it is an utter abomination that they would go after her on the grounds of her beliefs. And I think the statements that she's made that I've seen suggest that, well, she's not a radical social justice warrior, and she in fact embraced some of the decisions that were ultimately censored in these games. So it's kind of unclear why exactly she was selected as a target. Now, again, I don't follow her. I don't know, on what forums she's, writing these, her kind of feminist critiques. So but again, whatever your critique is, I don't think it should make you, a victim in this kind of way. Now, I will say that in a number of these articles, she, they referenced a photo shoot that she did. They linked to some Twitter pictures. And I would say that the pictures that she was posting, while not, scandalous or pornographic, were probably not the wisest moves, considering she already had a job with Nintendo. And I think what this highlights is, particularly for young people, particularly for, the quote-unquote millennials, people between the ages of, 19 and 28, there's been this increasing push to market yourself online, that you need an online presence, that you need a brand. And in the Kotaku article by Patrick Klepek, he, under the guise of kind of enlightened journalism, is like, well, it's hard to know what to do with this story because we're dealing with people and not products. And I would suggest that, no, we are dealing with people who are constructing themselves as products, as brands. And there's been a push, an obsessive push, to get as much out there as possible. Now, I'm not saying this as a, curmudgeonly old man. Of course, I'm on Twitter, I have the YouTube channel, I'm doing this, so I am, marketing myself, I guess, to a degree. But if you look at, people who are doing this, on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, what kind of stuff was she posting? It's that kind of, laid-back, sexualized photo, under the guise of presenting something else. So I'll give you an example. One of them has her, legs, in a tub, and she's like, oh, just relaxing on a business trip. It's, equivalent to the kind of thing you see on Instagram where, a girl is like, oh, look at this beautiful beach, and, in the foreground of the picture you have the lower half of her body in a bikini. It's, it's the, sexualization, as I said, hidden under the guise of presenting something, new or interesting to look at. And I realize that can be very effective. I'm sure people have millions of followers on all these different accounts. But once you have the job, particularly for a company like Nintendo, who, again, has a reputation, A, for being extraordinarily conservative, and B, for not really understanding social media, I'm surprised that she didn't, or someone didn't mention to her, hey, let's get this stuff, Nintendo are jerks. Let's get this stuff offline. You don't need to do this. It's a bad professional decision. Again, I don't believe she was a hooker. I'm not saying, that she needs to be a prude. She can do whatever she wants, obviously, in her personal life. And I don't think this is right that, Nintendo could construe what she did this way. But at the same time, we're dealing with heartless corporations. And a heartless corporation isn't going to, again, to look at, context. They are going to assess their liability. They're going to assess potential damage to their image and their brand, and they're going to, treat you as utterly dispensable if you do anything to piss them off. So, she needed to know that, and I'm surprised that she didn't. But, what the other thing that struck me, again, getting back to this idea of this new kind of marketing of self, is that, a lot of us do this, and it's fine. No one really cares, or, you have your fan base online. It doesn't really intersect with your real world. But to have these focused, opponent researchers come after you and dig up all of this stuff, it's very dangerous. It's kind of a dangerous new territory. I've argued, in a lot of other places, not necessarily related to gaming, that social media is ultimately kind of social surveillance. It's not exactly an insight on my part, but I think in this case, yeah, you're leaving this paper trail of ideas and actions and your different psychological states, different parts of your life, and that sort of authenticity is seen as good in this kind of social media marketing. You want to come off as authentic. You want to be on message without seeming on message. You just want it to seem like you're just a normal person, off the cuff. But ultimately, it's a very thin line, and the fact that an army of detractors could sort of dig this stuff up on you and have it cost you your career, or at least your job, it's a dangerous new world. And, of course, this is apparently what's done to politicians in a presidential campaign. The fact that anyone can be construed as a public figure, the fact that all this information is out there, when you present it to your employer, even if you've done nothing illegal, and, obviously, I'm not going to assume that she's an escort. I mean, Nintendo may have, as this kind of spotlight was placed on her, and, maybe they didn't pay attention at first, maybe they said, oh, well, what's going on, and they saw something that, again, was inconsistent with their corporate values. It can cost you your livelihood. And, and think about business politics. Think about the fact that, maybe someone hates you, maybe you have a rival, or maybe, your boss is looking for a way to get rid of you. This sort of thing, highlighting some aspect of your social media presence, and then looking at your contract and saying, well, could we construe this clause and this picture or this post as being a violation of this clause, and then you're going to lose your job. So very, very kind of dangerous horizon that we're seeing here with how social media, is being promoted on the one hand, but used as a weapon on the other. And then we come to the reporting about this, and particularly Kotaku, and they've been all over this for a while now with the Washington Post article. This is being used, I think, they want to position themselves as, the, educated, enlightened, authoritative voice of the hobby that would never engage in these kind of tactics, and that is, working for an inclusive and, progressive gaming community. And so they're, using this and really dismissing the idea that this has anything to do with, journalistic ethics. I've always said that the issue shouldn't be conflated. I think places like Kotaku and Destructoid and IGM and GameSpot have, lost a lot of authority. They have compromised themselves, and there are legitimate questions of journalistic ethics with all of those sites. But that's not to excuse the behavior of the people who, harass and threaten and dox people online. But yeah, I think this is very much being, used to salvage a damaged reputation on the part of these sites. I mean, how can Kotaku, a arm of Gawker Media, how could they possibly come out and suggest that they have any relation to real journalism when a lot of what they do is worthless clickbait? And of course, why have they been all over the story? Because it's clickbait. It draws attention from beyond gaming, and it's, I'm sure it's a very, very kind of profitable thing to write about. And I think in fairness, that's the same reason why people like Anita Sarkeesian kind of indirectly, fan the flames of the Gamergate folks, because again, it brings attention. Again, not to excuse the bomb threats, the rape threats, the harassment of family members, but, they have all, there's always been that saying that any publicity is good publicity, and I think that's very much at play here. And then, of course, you have the people themselves, the, so-called activist defenders of the gaming hobby, and this is cut and dry. I mean, they are so obviously wrong in this kind of harassment. What do you gain by, preying upon people this way? Who cares? Who cares if a feminist is trashing what you like? If you can't engage, if you can't engage the person intellectually, and you can't, attack their positions intelligently and critically and passionately, but you have to resort to these kind of tactics, you know what? You're fundamentally pathetic. I mean, there is no reason to do this. If anything, I would think it detracts from your game time. If you really like anime boobs, stop phoning in bomb threats and look at anime boobs. It's very, very simple. Why, give the person any publicity at all, okay, if you hate them that much? And, why set yourself up for being investigated and, or in some cases, you're committing a crime. It's stupid. And, my last point on this, and this affects both sides, is they say that there is a culture war in gaming. And I guess superficially that is true. There is a war obviously going on between two sides or two factions within the gaming hobby. But, and again, I brought this up in the last podcast, is why is gaming the battleground? Engaged feminists have such a wide variety of really, really important things to critique in this society. Why narrow yourself to identity politics within ultimately a niche and not very important realm? I mean, if you want to go after entertainment products, I think much more damage is done to women through Hollywood, through commercials, to say nothing of outright economic, workplace discrimination and things like that. You don't need to fight about anime tits. Okay, move on. And the same thing goes for, these truthers, opponent researchers, people who are pissed off at the gaming media. If you are pissed off at the gaming media or the media in general, there are so many more worthy critiques that could be made. There are so many worthy targets of your ire. If you're so good at digging up dirt on people, dig up dirt on people in the mainstream media. I'm not saying call in bomb threats. I'm not saying, call in rape threats or dox people. But, if you're really friggin' furious, you can use those technical skills in a much more politically productive way than, fighting over who says what in fucking Fire Emblem. I mean, this is an example of what I call the flavor of progressivism. Both sides want to feel progressive, both sides want to feel socially engaged, but no one wants to really, do the real difficult work of going after things in society that are fundamentally unjust. It's very, very easy to argue over Dead or Alive volleyball. It's a lot harder to take on Hollywood portrayals of women that, have a fundamentally more deleterious effect on young girls growing up. I mean, the way women are presented in Hollywood and commercials, things like that, that to me is what you need to go after. And again, if you think, the media is unethical, I mean, why are you dealing with Kotaku? Of course they're unethical. I mean, they just lost, 140, or Gawker, the parent company, lost 140, well, I guess they lose $140 million, but, their existence is threatened over a video of Hulk Hogan having sex. This media outlet has, disgraced itself. It doesn't need, we don't need you guys to go after them. Go after the media conglomerates. Go after the people who shape opinions. Go after people in the society who are fundamentally evil and unethical. And if you try to prove that, I mean, last point, I'm going to stop talking about this. Whoever the person was that leaked the Panama Papers, okay, that guy or girl, okay, that took some courage. That's digital hacking with some courage, with some true socially progressive intention behind it. The person said, I believe this is evil. I believe millions of people have suffered and or died as of the result of, buying weapons and, through these nefarious companies and avoiding sanctions and stuff like that. So I am releasing this. If you're such a great hacker, okay, if you're so great at, digging up dirt on people, at least do it with a truly meaningful agenda behind it and leave, the representation of anime chicks out of it. Use your time more wisely. One of the big stories that really occupied us in the early weeks of April was the continuing saga of the Coleco Chameleon, Retro VGS, Mike Kennedy scandal. And of course, strangely, I became involved with that whole thing with my parodies on the Chameleon and the Retro VGS, the Nostalgia SHIT videos, which I guess struck a chord with some people who were following that. So I'm not here to beat a dead horse to get on Kennedy. I think the satire in those videos kind of explains what my position on the endeavor was/is. But I want to look at the lessons that we've learned, and I think one of the issues with the Coleco Chameleon project, with the Retro VGS project, is that Kennedy made an attempt to really turn the hobby into a huge business. Now, obviously, you have the YouTube channels who have become kind of like their own brands. You've had niche products like the Retron 5 that were kind of tools to allow you to enjoy your hobby, in different ways, easy upscaling, things like that. You have the, I guess, like the new games, the homebrews that, add a different dimension to a system that already exists. What the Retro VGS project was about was kind of imposing a modern style video game business onto the hobby. And the question at the time, and I talked about this in my video looking at the Retro VGS initially, is that could our community sustain that type of a business? It's one thing for a guy to program a game for the SNES and put it onto a card and sell it at a convention and make some money off of it. It's another thing to, sustain a corporation, based on this community. And, to a degree, I think that Kennedy's attempt was such a spectacular miscalculation, and really kind of just his decisions and his, marketing approach were so flawed that it's kind of hard to answer whether or not the community could have sustained that kind of business. I mean, had he done everything, right, and had a prototype and, got on to Kickstarter or Indiegogo, could he have raised $2 million, or could he have, done the Chameleon for whatever it was, $200,000, $300,000? Yeah, I think that's a question that has yet to be answered. And I'm leaning towards, the negative. And someone on the Atari Age forums had a great post, and I cannot, there's 8,000 posts now, and I'm not going to go back and search it out, but someone said, look, we are retro gamers because ultimately we want to have fun, we want to enjoy, the products that we loved as kids, we want to kind of expand our collections and expand our hobbies, not for the sake of profit, but for the sake of our own enjoyment. And the problem with Kennedy is that he was trying to put a paywall between us and that enjoyment. And I think that's a fair criticism. I mean, obviously, the Mike Kennedy paywall could not sort of function with the stuff you already had, but hey, new cartridge-based system, kind of built-in collectability, possibly, if you believe the hype, the old companies and Konami and Capcom are going to release new games for the system. So, yeah, I think there was an attempt to monetize the hobby in a very aggressive way, much like modern game companies monetize the gaming experience very aggressively. So I would say that it's worthy to resist that, but I don't think the question has been answered. We just talked about the analog NT, which arguably is not the same approach. It's a very, very niche product. But the question remains, to what degree can this community sustain businesses, that are kind of larger than one or two person operations? I guess I would say that when it comes to the actual software, I think there is probably room for a developer, whether on Steam or actually releasing, physical products for the old systems, to really, I think, carve out a nice little niche. And what I mean by that is, really create, not just release the occasional homebrew or prototype, but really come out with a kind of a palette of games for, the NES, N64, PlayStation, if that's possible. We haven't seen people coming out with stuff for those systems, but what, and I may be missing something, but I don't think a company has sort of come out with an IP and say, released different iterations of it on a variety of different platforms. Like, I think probably there's money to be made if you said, okay, I have this original video game IP, and I'm going to release kind of the first game on the NES, and the sequel is going to be on the SNES, and then the third installment is going to be on the Dreamcast, and they're inherently limited and collectible, and really good games worth playing. I think a company that took that approach probably could sustain itself to a degree with the retro gaming market. But I am not really sure if another, console, another, sort of game ecosystem, console software licensing like Kennedy was trying to do, is really possible. Now, there's a couple different, I guess, data points you can look at, sort of the people who backed Shenmue, and that was such a quick, backing process, and, when will that game be released, and what will it look like? Who knows? But, games like that got a lot of money on Kickstarter. Games like the Castlevania game, I'm really blanking on it, but the guy who did Castlevania had the Kickstarter. He was able to raise a lot of money. Obviously, Mighty Number 9, which sounded great back in 2013. We're still waiting to see what it looks like. So you have that. I don't have the sales data on the Retron 5. I'm not sure that it was released by Hyperkin, but I'd be curious to see how many people bought that. But again, that is more of a tool than it is its own kind of console and game ecosystem. But, on the other hand, the fact that, Kennedy's venture collapsed, the fact that it seems like people are struggling to really make a living off of retro gaming, and there are people who are trying it. If you read what people hope to do on Patreon, and, if you're listening to this podcast, you know who I'm talking about, the people who have the big Patreon campaigns, and you look at what their ultimate stretch goals are. I don't think that any have really reached the level where they can make YouTube or retro gaming their full-time commitment. Now, again, there are some, like the video game nerd guy, one or two people who are doing it. But, maybe that's all. I don't know that the market can sustain several brands who operate solely within this space. So, again, it's a question that is not going to be immediately answered. I think in the next 5 years we'll have a better idea, what brands, companies, whatever, can be sustained by the community. And for my personal take is that I actually would prefer it to remain a community and not really be a market, because I think one of the great things about retro gaming is that it is still a group of enthusiasts rather than a broad-based market. Now, a couple weekends ago, I was cleaning out a closet here in my house, and I came upon a box that had a ton of old stuff, schoolwork and readings and sort of binders of stuff from college and grad school, and I was kind of going through it, and I found an essay that I had to read in a political science class in graduate school called Immaterial Labor by a guy named Maurizio Lazzarto, who is a sociologist, I think, from Italy. And this is a fairly influential essay. I think it was released in maybe the early to mid-90s, probably towards the early 90s, I would say. And I just kind of remember this being one of the better essays that I've ever read, and I kind of was thumbing through it again, and it's shockingly contemporary, I would say. It has not aged at all, and as I've kind of been sort of stewing about YouTube and kind of the positives and negatives of how YouTube has developed, specifically within the retro gaming community, I really saw this essay as kind of being very informative for that kind of reflection that I was engaging in. So I'll just talk a little bit about this essay. It is really a great read. It's not terribly long, and you can probably find it online for free. Now, the basic argument here, and again, think of the time, early 90s, was that the economy and production was kind of in a transformational period. We're moving from the kind of traditional, Henry Ford, company, workforce, product model to what he refers to as an author work audience model of production. And within this new model, his argument was that, work was changing. And I think he was largely right. If you look at the kind of work we're doing today, it's, by and large, not assembly line type of stuff. It is engaging in communication for various purposes. So the immaterial labor that he talks about, immaterial being not, assembly line, production line type stuff, not the actual fabrication of products, but in, the kind of network of communication that surrounds the products and the various different kinds of economic activity that's, is necessary for, successfully marketing a product. So immaterial labor, in his definition, lends a product or process or business process, an intellectual content and an aesthetic content. So if you want to think about the iPad as a good example. So the sort of material labor process is done in Foxconn in China, and so that's how the product comes to be. The intellectual content would be iOS and the various apps that go into it. And then the aesthetic content would be not just the marketing of the product by Apple, but its reception by, reviewers, its consumption by consumers, and there's kind of a feedback loop. I might find a new way to use the iPad, and that in turn will lead someone to develop an app to, take advantage of this kind of functionality. The app, in turn, or this sort of use of the iPad, my own consumer habit with the app might actually change, how the next model of the iPad is produced. I mean, I was thinking of something like Uber here. I want a cheaper cab ride. I want to sort of... Now, I've never used Uber myself, so I'm just going by what I've read. Typically, if I have to get somewhere, I just drive myself. But anyway, right, Uber, you want a ride, you call it in, through the app. I'm guessing it uses, your GPS coordinates to figure out where the nearest driver is, directs the driver to you, and he takes you in the best possible route to wherever it is that you're going. I think that's the type of thing that Lazzarto was talking about. So, in his discussion of this, he'll talk about how the people who work in this realm of kind of being an intermediary between the marketing of the product and its consumption, he actually talks about, well, these are the people who, are producing audiovisual content, amongst other things. And, isn't that YouTube? Or at least that's my reading of it. So, and obviously he had no idea that YouTube would exist, but his argument was just that there's all sorts of, work that goes into sort of creating profitability that doesn't happen within the company. It'll happen, with independent contractors, and it will also occur within, a community of consumers and also then people who will sort of comment on consumption. I think of this is where the YouTube reviewer comes in. And the Lazzarto goes on to say that, these are people who work on a freelance basis, largely, and of course he's trying to, lend this essay and this argumentation a kind of predictive value. So he would say, these are people who are not going to be directly employed by a company, but they'll be hired on sort of a part-time basis. They'll complete some aspect of the communicative project surrounding a product, and then they'll sort of recede into, what he calls the networks and flows of the modern economy. So think about like a YouTube review. You want to create some mind share around a product. You look, you see who are the popular YouTubers, you cut a branding deal with them, or you send them a free sort of copy or example of whatever it is you're trying to sell. This person, uses this to create, a mind share, around the product. He makes some money. The company benefits directly from what is essentially kind of an indirect marketing strategy. It's not coming from their advertising firm or their marketing department. So, I think the whole social media revolution is an example of this immaterial labor, but it gets even more interesting because he talks about, and this is kind of sort of a brief one-off aspect of this essay, but he talks about how in this situation, not only are the roles that people play within the production of a commodity fundamentally different, and, not only is it now the reality that, your consumption of the product doesn't kind of use it up, it actually produces the conditions for further innovation. But he says that, for people who are in this, the kind of last phase, sort of standing in between the marketing and the consumption, the people who are engaged in adding the aesthetic content to the product, that their life no longer has that clear distinction between, work and leisure. That more, with increasing frequency, I guess you can say, life is work, work is life. Work becomes as pleasurable as leisure activity, but it's still kind of produces value, and people will just kind of do this, sometimes of their own accord. And it's strange because I remember in that class where we read this essay, there was kind of another piece that picked up on this particular argument and went forward with it. And I couldn't find, I mean, that wasn't in this box, and I can't remember who wrote it. But, basically that, drawing on this point that Lazzarto makes, basically when you are, let's say you're working, let's take the Uber example. Let's say you're an Uber driver, and you're kind of working within this new model of production and consumption. Maybe Uber kind of tells you how to behave as a driver. There's standards that you're kind of embracing. So you're in this kind of new economy model of work, but you still have the creative impulse. Where do you go? What do you do after you're done, working? I guess you're not even working a shift. You're just sort of picking up people. You're on the clock. Okay, I'm going to work for 5 hours, and you just go pick people up and do whatever it is that you do. I don't know. Again, correct me if I'm wrong about how Uber works. Or let's just say, you're working for Apple. You're creating, a specific software package for iOS. Anyway, the point being, in this other article that I read back in the day, kind of drawing on these ideas, is that you'll still search for a creative outlet. And no matter what work it is that you do, because there's this kind of what we can call, I guess, a democracy of digital production, you can actually sort of embed yourself in the process of immaterial labor, very easily. And it just becomes your own way of expressing yourself creatively. Now, I think that's what YouTube fundamentally latched onto in the early days, and that made a billion-dollar business out of it, is when you give people, the tools to quote-unquote broadcast yourself, which was one of the early, advertising slogans of YouTube. People will just naturally gravitate to doing that kind of work, and that work is actually very valuable. Now, it costs you relatively little to do it. Of course, you need the computer, the internet connection, cameras, but these are things that a lot of people just have lying around. So the cost of actually broadcasting yourself is relatively low, but you don't actually get any of the sort of profit potential. Of course, now with the partner program and monetization, you get a little bit of money. Some people do well, but for the most part, you're just throwing a video up there. You're contributing to the YouTube ecosystem. You're doing a very valuable kind of immaterial labor. You're doing it essentially for free, or you're doing it for a very, very low level of remuneration. But YouTube is making billions and billions of dollars because, everyone can do this very easily. And so in that sort of add-on piece to immaterial labor, that person, again, I wish I remember who it was, but anyway, that person said, okay, so we can establish, empirically that, as Lazzarto did, that, the work, the dynamics of work are changing. And, we're now in a knowledge economy, and, people are contributing a very valuable kind of communication and kind of creating this atmosphere around a product that will increase sales and increase consumption and things like that. But, the ability to do that sort of on your own time will also become kind of a feature of modern life. And this, I think is fundamentally right, not just in the YouTube example, but look at Instagram, look at Twitter, look at the commodification of attention, which I think is the ultimate goal of social media, and I've talked about that in a number of videos on my channel. It sort of, I think was predicted really nicely by this, strain of argumentation that you see in this essay and some of these other essays from the early 90s. Right? You can actually turn your life into a commodity, you can sort of, be an indirect marketer of a lot of things for these companies, and it's fundamentally rewarding. I mean, I'm not saying like, oh, I'm, above and beyond all this. I mean, I find it, in some instances very rewarding to, you post something on Reddit and you get all of those responses back, or, I review something, or I create a video about a video game, and it's an outlet, it's a form of expression, but it's also a very cheap kind of labor that I'm offering up to YouTube or Reddit or Instagram that draws kind of in aggregate all of this labor, all of this creation, sort of draws eyeballs to the site, maybe not to what I'm doing. And obviously, if you look at my view counts, not a lot of eyeballs are landing on what I'm doing specifically, but it creates this very profitable ecosystem for a variety of companies, and it just, I guess at the end of the day, in total, creates an environment where, more products can be more easily sold. I mean, we see it with, retro gaming, how it went from this isolated hobby to this, community of collectors, and prices on different games have skyrocketed because we've created an environment very friendly to the selling or reselling of old games. That's why games like Contra are $40 or $50 these days, when prior to the whole internet boom, you could get it for, $5 at a garage sale or a couple bucks at Funko Land. So, that's interesting. Would you call that exploitation? I think it's, yes and no. I mean, do you want to go back to the old sort of Henry Ford factory, or, the vision of work that you had in the, 19th century, where it was just this soul-destroying, repetitive manual labor on the one hand, or there was a clear distinction between, the worker and the manager? Certainly, I don't think we would want to go back to these games. There's an exciting kind of freedom that goes along with the knowledge economy. But on the other hand, when you look at this kind of, again, author work audience, author being the company, obviously work being the product, audience being the consumer that, again, shapes the previous two entities in that process. When you get to that sort of last link, the aesthetic, immaterial labor that goes into the indirect marketing of a product, it may make you feel good to be an Instagram star or a YouTube star, but on the other hand, we are actually doing a lot of the uncompensated or poorly compensated legwork for these companies. So it's a kind of an interesting model that's developed. And on my channel a couple months ago, I did a video. A woman wrote a long and really, really good article on Fusion about how difficult it was for her to make a living off of YouTube and her other sort of various ventures in social media, where, she found herself like she wasn't a star, but yet she could make enough money to live if she really worked at it. But it was actually for her kind of discouraging and soul-destroying. I think it's called The Economics of Internet Fame. If you search that, you'll probably find it. Again, it was on Fusion. You'll find my video on it. But yeah, so it was just interesting, finding this article that was written, 26, 27 years ago now, whatever it was, and, how appropriate it is for the kind of social media landscape which we all inhabit. So on the last podcast, I talked about VR being a kind of revolutionary moment in gaming. And despite all of the issues that have been going on with the shipping of the Vive and the Oculus Rift, obviously I stand by that. We're in the infancy of what can be a really exciting transformation in the consumption of games and probably media in general. And it led me to thinking after I recorded that episode, we haven't had a truly revolutionary change in gaming in a really long time. And I was kind of satisfied with that. Like, yeah, that's, I think, a pretty interesting opinion. And of course, then, as I thought about it, I said, well, I don't know that I can really make that claim. Because, of course, online multiplayer and the rise of online internet-connected gaming could probably be construed as a revolutionary change in gaming. And of course that took hold, I would say, really in its current form, of truly connected platforms. You could say arguably at the beginning of the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 generation. Certainly since 2010, 2011, it has been really the norm. But in identifying that prejudice, I really had to ask myself, is it the same kind of revolution that we're seeing in VR? And I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced. I think, to be purely objective, I think you have to include it in that conversation. But as I went back and I kind of looked at another transformational moment, for me, that was the release of the Super Nintendo. Now, again, that was a time where, you've been playing the SNES for a couple of years, you've been playing the NES for a couple of years, and then you saw the Super Nintendo, going from, say, Mega Man 2. And I remember this very clearly. I was at home one weekend. I had rented, probably for the 19th time, Mega Man 2, struggling to beat the game, never did. And as a kid, I found it very frustrating. But anyway, continued to rent it, played it, this one weekend. And then my parents took me to a cousin's house. And the cousins had just gotten the Super Nintendo with F-Zero. And I looked, I was like, okay, I just finished playing the NES at home. I'm at my cousin's house. I'm seeing F-Zero, revolutionary moment. And I think the distinction that perhaps I was, maybe subconsciously making was, revolutionary moments in gaming, with regard to the single player experience. And so how do we rate those kind of innovations with, or against the innovation that is online gaming? Well, it's a fairly interesting question because I think throughout the history of video games, it was always about, always is too strong. It was primarily about extending and expanding and evolving the single-player engagement with the game. And you can take that back, to certainly, the NES or just the advent of multi-screen games, so rather than having, Donkey Kong on one screen or, Pac-Man on a single screen, you had a kind of linear motion in the early Nintendo games that allowed for kind of storytelling. The very idea of being able to interchange cartridges. When you think about, giving the player the ability to not just have the Pong, connected to the television, but swap out carts and have different gaming experiences. The evolution of controllers, when you think about the introduction of the analog stick and kind of giving you the ability to move through 3D space, and of course 3D graphics themselves being, I think, a major and I think often overlooked innovation in gaming. I mean, coming from a time, when we weren't used to seeing 3D games, unless you had a computer, and even then there was something about the early, Mario game on the N64 that even blew that away. The adoption of the CD as a medium and being able to just store more information on a disc and make games, more plentifully and more cheaply than they had been before. All these things, you could find any number of. I mean, you can go back and say, the introduction of the, micro switch, in the arcade, as far as offering, great durability and, allowing, essentially for a whole generation of great arcade gameplay, arguably a single and multiplayer deal. The introduction and kind of the move to 3D graphics processing in computers, any one of these things is they were all fundamentally ways to, again, enhance the single-person experience of the game. And they felt that way. Again, it's going to seem odd, but as someone who grew up and who, witnessed those changes and witnessed, getting these different systems and seeing something fundamentally new where you said to yourself, you know what, I don't know if I could go back to the way things were. Now, obviously, as a retro gamer, you ultimately do, and you have that sort of sense of nostalgia and perspective. So I'm not saying that, these are lasting changes, but, I think if you talk to a lot of people and you move from those early games, or even, moving from the Atari, and I didn't have an Atari, but, I think I talked about this in some video. Anyway, well, no one probably watched it, but I didn't like Atari. I didn't like video games. I had a friend who had Atari, and she was a little bit older. I was a really young kid here, and so, friend of the family, and, my parents would drop me off at this person's house, and the parents would, sit us down in the basement and say, okay, play Atari, and, I remember Frogger and stuff like that, and, I said, this sucks. What the hell is that? But, of course, I had been playing in the arcades a little bit too at that point, which looked a lot better than the Atari. But, with the Atari, you had to kind of fundamentally use your imagination. Okay, that little blurb of pixels kind of looks like E.T. To the Nintendo, where, it had the visual fidelity to create, basic cartoony representations and recognizable representations of these characters. Even that, all of these things were transformational moments, and you didn't want to go back to the old platform. I would suggest that we really haven't had that since the Dreamcast PlayStation 2 era. And even then, it wasn't a huge leap. Or at least it took a while. It wasn't there immediately on launch. Now, you look at the introduction of multiplayer online gaming, and, obviously on a kind of obvious and superficial comparison, that was never about, that was never about the single-player experience, but has it been a revolutionary change? Well, as much as I don't like online gaming, I would have to say, again, objectively, yes, it is. I think so many people, have this kind of competitive, adrenaline-inducing experience with those games, and that's meaningful, and I can't, even though I don't like that, I think it would be wrong of me to degrade that as somehow being inauthentic, that, the single-player evolutions that I witnessed, or the single-player transformations that I witnessed were somehow, on a higher order than, the online turn in gaming. So I'm not, I don't think I can say that. That having been said, I do think that they're fundamentally different. I think it has created a situation in gaming now where the game has moved from an experience, and that word is, I think, overused, and of course I'm guilty of overusing it, but, games changed from an experience to a platform. I think you see that very strongly with something like Hearthstone, about which I've spoken on numerous occasions, or, really any game now. It's a social, interactive platform, and the expectations have changed. The question is not, how much gameplay you're getting out of the game, but what is the lobby experience like? How is the matchmaking? How does it handle, is the netcode, about fighters or something like that, does it have solid netcode, and can you, have those seamless online matches? Thinking about, rankings and, streaming your skill at these games, relative to the other players against whom you're playing online, it's it's different. But I do think, and again, I'm going to bracket this as perhaps being an overly subjective assessment, but somehow that is just it didn't revolutionize, or I should say, the experience that you have with the game hasn't changed, even if the way you play it has been revolutionized. Now, that's not to totally, again, I don't want to totally trash it. In fact, I think some of the benefits of online connectivity have been underused. And I think there's a kind of connected single-player experience that has not been fully explored. What do I mean by that? I'll give, the example of a Demon's Souls game, right? That was, as far as I can tell, the first game where you could kind of see, or at least console game that I remember, where you can kind of, the connected experience allowed you to see, what other people had done, where they had fallen, leave notes for each other in what was, I think a very difficult game. So, you were connected to these other people. I mean, think about Journey, something very similar. You were traversing this beautiful, abstract world, and you could come across another player also in the world and have to kind of communicate non-verbally, and I think, was there like a chirp in there? It's been a long time since I played Journey, but that experience is that connected single-player experience. And then even something more modern, like the Drivatar system in the Forza games on the Xbox One, even though when that came out, it's like, Drivatar, that's marketing speak, but actually collecting data on other drivers' habits, so that when you get into that single-player career race, each race feels different, especially if you up the difficulty level. So, that's the sort of thing I think I'd like to see explored even more, and that could be the revolutionary turn that I'm looking for anyway. But I think VR is, incidentally, or ironically, I should say, kind of going back to that original transformation. It's a fundamental transformation of the single-player experience, and I think that is why, in the long run, I'm very excited about it, even though I have not jumped in here at the very beginning. It is the kind of transformation that, frankly, I've been waiting for a long time. Now, will it pan out in the ways that I expressed in the last episode? I don't know. I hope ultimately it does. But I would say, to me, it fosters an excitement that the standard internet-connected game does not. And, looking forward to seeing how it plays out.
That's really neat.
Well, Andy, we have all this stuff here. Let's start with this system right here. Tell us a little bit about it, what it is.
This is the TurboGrafx 16 by NEC. It has a lot of arcade-quality games, very sharp graphics and sound, and the games come on small little turbo chips, they call them. These are little game cards, a little bigger than like a credit card.
Wow.
And they plug into the game system, and what you get on the screen is phenomenal.
Wow.
What are some of the components of the system that you're going to get there?
Well, with this system, it costs a little less than $200. You get the game machine, you get a turbo pad, which is your controller,
right,
and you get a game called Keith Courage in Alpha Zones, which is a running and jumping game, very similar to Super Mario Brothers. But again, the graphics, the character is very large, and the sound is very spectacular.
Wow. Right. So any special features about this, I guess, besides the sound?
Just that it's the next step. It's really the next game machine, like the Genesis, in that it's a lot crisper. The pictures are a lot crisper, and the sound, instead of a lot of beeps and clicks that you used to get with the older game machines, you really hear music and you really hear voices.
Wow.
About a year ago on my YouTube channel, I released a video called Alternate History. And in that case, it was the alternate history of the TurboGrafx 16. And I had this idea of doing a series where I looked at failed systems and kind of asked, how they could have been more successful. And I had an idea to just do a number of these, and I didn't get around to it. So I'm going to shift that to the podcast. Every now and then do an alternate history of a system, perhaps also companies. I mean, you could do this for a lot of different things. But I'm going to stick to hardware and do an alternate history of perhaps the most difficult system for which to do an alternate history, and that is the Virtual Boy. And I was an owner of the Virtual Boy way back in the day. I still have it. And I got to tell you, this is a tough one to really come up with a good alternate history, because the Virtual Boy was an abject failure. It was Nintendo's, obviously. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably know that this was Nintendo's only truly failed system. It was around for 1 year. I think it was fall 95 to fall 96 here in North America. It only had 19 games released. And so the question is, how could Nintendo have made this system a success? Well, if you look at just the data surrounding it, it's kind of hard to make that case. The Virtual Boy, suffered from a number of setbacks, one of which is that you knew, and I knew this back in the day, and I got it anyway, but you knew that the N64 was on the horizon. You had read about it, you had heard about it in the retro magazines of the time. So with that being the case, at a release price of, I believe, $180, why would you spend that money? Especially if you're a kid, if you're paying for the stuff yourself, well, that money should go towards the new Nintendo system. Then you have the issue of the color. This was a monochromatic, red console, and it was not pleasant to look at. And they said that if they had tried to actually add, a color experience, that the system would have been more expensive, and it would have made you sort of motion sick. The graphics would be too jumpy. I remember reading that somewhere, which is not to say that you didn't get motion sickness and headaches, because the Virtual Boy was a console that physically made you ill, and it did to me. And as an adult, when I go back to it, it's even worse. I cannot play that system for longer than 15 minutes. Otherwise, I do get nauseous, and I do have headaches. So, obviously it had that working against it. And the ad campaign, which on television, if you remember it, it worked on me to a degree. It's like, okay, well, this is a fundamentally new experience. This is as close as we're going to get to virtual reality. That's why I'm doing it here, because now we actually have virtual reality headsets out on the market. But yeah, it was this idea that Nintendo was truly innovating. And so they had all of this great marketing, and you saw it in the magazines. But one thing that they had to combat was the idea that when you took a screenshot or attempted to take a screenshot of a Virtual Boy game, it looked bad. It looked like this kind of red on black smudgy mess. So they partnered up with Blockbuster Video, and you could rent it. I don't remember what game you got. I didn't rent it. I actually bought it sight unseen, and of course I bought it at a time when the price had been cut a little bit, but I would say 3-4 months into its run, I think I got it. So anyway, people were renting these for $10-15 at Blockbuster, and taking them home, and then you got some sort of voucher to go buy it, or you got like a few bucks off buying it. And I think that actually hurt it, because when people realize, oh, I have to set this on the table, I can't attach it to my head, I have neck pain, I'm nauseous, I have a headache, oh, and wait, the games don't look that great, and the games aren't very good, that's a lot working against it. So Nintendo probably shouldn't have done that. Okay, we've got the negatives out of the way. How could this console have been saved? Well, on the one hand, Nintendo could have, I guess, have done a little more R&D and figure out how to get at least a couple of different colors on the screen. And if it meant that it had to be $200, $225, that might have been a reasonable trade-off. If we're talking MSRP for the red graphics would have been $180, and then MSRP with color graphics would have been $300. Yeah, I think that's a non-starter. But that's one option. Second option, I thought, well, maybe the Virtual Boy could have included backwards compatibility with the Game Boy, and if not, obviously back in those days it couldn't sort of interpolate the image and then sort of come up with a 3D rendering of it, but you could have had like like they did with the Super Game Boy. Like you could have had like a 3D movie theater effect, and then you could say, oh, well, play your Game Boy games in a 3D environment. I think that would have helped. I know that would have helped with me because I had a pretty sizable Game Boy collection at that time. But not a lot to really save the console. Could have had better games, of course. I would argue that, aside from Wario Land, which is actually one of my favorite games of all time. I mean, that was a fabulous effort. None of the other games were really that great. You had some sort of, fun, what I would call casual games like the Tennis Pack-In. You had... I actually remember playing the golf game, whatever golf game they released on there. You had the old-fashioned sort of Mario Brothers pipe game. I forget what that was called. Clash or something. Mario Clash. So, you had some stuff, but there wasn't an engrossing RPG. There wasn't another great platformer. There weren't, beyond those few Nintendo games, a lot of, tried and true Nintendo characters and individual games with those characters. So I think, if they had done something like a Mario Kart 3D, I think that would have done really, really well. That could have worked nicely, use the graphics engine from the SNES, and again, just, you have that Mode 7 look, but now the objects are in 3D. I think that would have been really, really good. Of course, a Legend of Zelda game would have shifted some units. Definitely, 3D style dungeons could have helped. But obviously that's a lot of development money to kind of put towards a system that I think Nintendo knew was, to borrow the words of Sega, not its future, with regard to the Saturn there. So what would have been a more reasonable course of action, rather than boosting up the price by adding color, pouring tons and tons of money into development resources for a system that was going to be outdated in a year? What would have been the third option? I think it would have been to use, there's a port on the, it's on the side or the back of the console, an extension port. So it could communicate with other Virtual Boys. I don't think any game ever used that. I know I didn't use it, and I don't think the cable was actually included, but I think to even make it a moderate success, they would have had to find a way to, interface with the N64, for example. Come up with some way to do that, some mini game that you could play in the Virtual Boy, some kind of asynchronous play where you're playing an RPG and then you kind of have to look into the Virtual Boy to do something else. That would have prolonged its life. Pokemon came out in 1995, at least in Japan. I think it maybe was a year later, but maybe having a Pokemon game or some sort of way that you could interface between the Pokemon on the Game Boy and something in the Virtual Boy, whether it was its own Pokemon game or kind of an associated game that would let you, I train your characters, or there's some function that you could have added to the Virtual Boy. I think that would have been the only way to prolong its life. Would it have made it a success? No, but you could have seen a scenario in which, if you were a real Nintendo fan and you had the Game Boy and you had the N64, that owning the Virtual Boy and using these interactive features, would have been kind of the ultimate step. It's like, okay, you've bought all Nintendo systems, now you can do things and you can have experiences that you couldn't do without all three pieces of the puzzle. And if that were to have been the case, I think, instead of being canceled in 96, I think you could have seen this thing kind of roll through 97, 98. And even though it's a fun collectible item now, I actually think it would have been a pretty, pretty substantial, would have had pretty substantial collector's appeal, because, if you had, the Pokemon game, if you had a couple of more, good games and the cables, and you could actually use the Virtual Boy to complete or enhance other games that you had for other systems, would have been popular. So again, it wasn't going to make it a world beater, but I think that latter idea of integrating it better with the other Nintendo hardware could have at least made this console a, mediocre performer rather than an outstanding failure. Next up, I want to talk about a new kind of nostalgia that I've been experiencing over the past couple of weeks here in April. And, I think if you're listening to this show, I think if you're engaged in the retro community on YouTube or listening to different retro podcasts, reading things like Hardcore Gaming 101, things like that, you have a ingrained sort of affinity for nostalgia. And that was certainly the case. That's why I discovered the retro gaming community. That's why I got into retro gaming, because I was able to, go back and appreciate so many of the games that I enjoyed in my youth. So the site of my nostalgia was always late 80s to mid 90s gaming. And I think for relatively obvious reasons, you have a lot of nostalgia for the time in which you discovered gaming, the time in which, as a child, you were most heavily engaged with video games. And I don't think that will ever change. But what has been interesting over the past couple of weeks has been the fact that I have discovered a nostalgia for a second period of time. And this kind of surprised me. And that sort of time period will put from like 2006 until 2011, sort of that 5-year period in which I would say the retro gaming community really came into being through things like YouTube and podcasting, but also what I think we can increasingly call a transitional period in gaming, a move away from the traditional business models of gaming, which is you release a game on a disc, you try to do new things with it, relative to what came before it, to the model that we have now with extreme DLC and microtransactions and things like that. And what spurred this on was I just had this, I was kind of bored one night, wasn't going out, and I had this desire to listen to the All Gen Gamers podcast, like from the old days, like episode 3 or 4. And, back when those guys were, passionate and engaged in what they were talking about. And it was really a sensational and kind of different podcast, insofar as that it was an expression of this newfound nostalgia that could be experienced and shared through the internet, and also a kind of enthusiasm for the games that were being released. I guess that podcast started in 2010, maybe. So, just listening to them talk about all the quote-unquote new games, the games of the time. And I have to say that this was not a period in my life where I was, a passionate gamer, or that I necessarily had a lot of time for gaming. I was still, buying video games. I was still, I was very much invested in the PlayStation 3. But, I didn't have the Wii or the Xbox 360 or the DS, or I guess I got the PSP maybe in 2010. And it was also a time where, I was in grad school. And it's funny, being in graduate school is a fairly interesting, part of your life. It's a time in your life when, you have a lot of work to do, but at the same time, you have a lot of downtime. And I really remember that as I moved through my graduate education, as I got into my second and third year and my sort of course requirements tapered off and I was doing research and stuff like that, I had a lot of free time on my hands. And it was in that free time that I discovered things like Happy Console Gamer, what is it called? The Classic Game Room. It was in this time that I really got into import gaming for the PS2, and then sort of, as kind of a background activity, paid attention to the releases that were coming out at that time, and of course buying things for the PS3 here and there. Now, because at some point you have to get back to work, I could never, and of course being a graduate student, you didn't have a ton of disposable income, so I could never really dive into the hobby as deeply as I would a few years later. But it was also, it gave you a sense of freedom, and it's kind of interesting to go back, especially now, and look in, my collection and find those games that I picked up years later. DS RPGs or PSP RPGs, Wii games that I kind of missed during their initial run. And quite frankly, I am nostalgic about it because I think, and again, this really triggered by listening to those early episodes of the All Gen Gamers podcast. There was that sense of possibility still that, gaming was going to offer us something authentic and new and interesting. And, again, I did have that with the PlayStation 3. And I think if you fast forward until today, what are we really getting out of game? We're getting, very, very refined versions of kind of derivative products. I mean, think about all of the stuff that comes out. It's not exactly groundbreaking, even though it's highly polished. We're now in a time where the purchase and ownership of the game has really been fundamentally altered. In 2008, when I got, was it 2008 or 2009, when I picked up Oblivion on the PlayStation 3, $60 or whatever it was when I got it, owned it, played it for hours. I didn't have to worry about, microtransactions, although there was the Shivering Isles DLC, which I don't know that I actually got on the PS3. I may have picked that up on PC a number of years later. But anyway, you got your money's worth. It still felt like. That's not the case anymore. Your relationship to the game has changed. So I guess it's kind of a double nostalgia. Nostalgia, going back to that old school feeling that I buy a game, for the most part, I get my money's worth. Plus, that time in grad school is, still kind of youthful. Still had more time on my hands, actually, than I did, arguably, in high school and undergraduate. Just going back to those days of, writing all day and then having a stretch of 4 or 5 hours at night where I could game. It's kind of interesting, but, I really now want to look back and go into the collection and really pull out those games, specifically, like I said, for the Wii and the DS. DS being a system that I kind of wrote off at the time as kind of like a kiddie type system. I didn't really want to, do too much with it. Didn't feel any need to purchase it. And go back and enjoy that time and kind of look at, kind of the last days of innocence in the hobby. And again, if you want to think of it also in terms of the burgeoning retro community, it was a time, before largely multi-channel networks and extreme monetization of videos. There was kind of a very raw authenticity to the guys coming on YouTube back in the day and just, talking about their favorite games and not really, there was just a thrill in being able to broadcast that nostalgia for the first time. Whenever we want to mark that date, I always look at it with Happy Console Gamer and Classic Game Room. I discovered them, I think, in 2008 or 2009, and was like, wow, there are people talking about these great old games online. This is pretty cool. You look at it 7 or 8 years on, and I think, largely, and I'm not talking about those guys in particular, but largely there's kind of a formulaic approach It's kind of become its own genre, its own business. And I don't think, and that's not to say that that's totally bad, but, I miss those days when, the communal appreciation of nostalgia was something new. So, tweet at me, let me know if this is just me, if I'm just sort of a hopeless, nostalgic person who is going to find some sort of nostalgic connection to all phases of life, or, do you see this really becoming a kind of, new second wave nostalgia in the hobby? So, one thing I came across as I was reading through the gaming news this past month was that Atlas is turning 30 years old, and I can't believe that. Atlas is a company that you don't associate, or at least I never associated with gaming in the 80s, but they did, of course, start in 1986, and I thought this would be an interesting time to kind of look back on my experience with Atlas games and really, assess their legacy. Is Atlas a great company that we can hold in the same esteem as Squaresoft, Nintendo, Sega, and so forth? So, a little bit about my personal history with Atlas. I'm probably like a lot of people in that I really didn't start to pay attention to Atlas until Persona 3 and 4 on the PlayStation 2. But they have an incredibly long history. They were developing for the NES, and in fact, developing NES games that were released here in the States. Of course, we never got the Megami Tensei games, but we did get, I'm just going to call it up here, things like the Karate Kid, Friday the 13th. These were games that I actually played quite a lot as a kid. They were not branded as Atlas games. I think the Karate Kid and Friday the 13th were LJN games. But those came out in the late 80s for the American NES. And I recall, now Friday the 13th is kind of a controversial game, but I had a friend who loved that game, and in fact we played through it a couple of years ago, and it's not good, but back then it had that sense of, oh, it's scary, sort of puzzle solving, going around that camp, pretty good there. And I guess my consciousness of Atlas as a company came about with, believe it or not, the Virtual Boy and Jack Brothers. Now, I don't have Jack Brothers, but I remember when I got the Virtual Boy, sort of, looking at the games and saying, oh, here's this game that looks kind of cool, this top-down. I haven't really played Jack Brothers in a long time. I tried to emulate it years ago, but it didn't work out too well. But anyway, that sort of top-down puzzle game, and I thought, do I buy this or do I buy a sports game? And at that point, I was sort of tossing up, baseball or golf, which actually were import titles that you could get at Sears. And I went with golf, and of course, Jack Brothers is maybe the most expensive U.S. Virtual Boy game, so really killed myself there. And then when the N64 came out, they had a snowboarding game. I'm going to get the name of this wrong. I have to look this up. I had a friend who got this, and we had some pretty good times with it. It's like Snowboarding Kids or something. SBK, Snowboard Kids, I believe, although that came out on the 97, yeah. So 97. Again, I think that was published by Atlas. It says here a company called Rack-Dim made it, but yeah, I mean, I saw the Atlas name anyway, and I was like, oh, okay, this is Atlas. And then, of course, during the PlayStation 1 era, PlayStation 1 was really the first time that you saw them coming out in North America with a lot of these awesome RPGs. They did, obviously, the 2 Persona games. I'm just looking here. Other games that they released. Oh yeah, they had a Bomberman Fantasy Race. They did the first Guilty Gear, things like that. So, I would say at that point, kind of said, oh yeah, there's this other company that's coming out with these somewhat niche Japanese games. This is something to kind of pay attention to. But really, my dollars back in those days went to Squaresoft, because Squaresoft, that PlayStation era of Squaresoft was absolutely so amazing, and so whenever I was going to buy an RPG, I just gravitated to the Squaresoft name and kind of forgot to pursue these, Persona games for the PlayStation. Of course, again, you kind of kick yourself because, well, they are, like Persona 2, is worth quite a bit of money, but I have to say that, it really wasn't until Persona 3 on the PlayStation 2 that I really, played one of their better games anyway, with any, for any length of time, with any great depth. And Persona 3 was really a revelation. Now, this game came out in 2007, and of course, I had already purchased the PlayStation 3 at that point, and then of course Persona 4 in 2008. But I was intrigued, by the reviews these games were getting, and also by the fact that it seemed like this company had poured in a tremendous amount of effort for an older console, and I wanted to be a part of that. So I went to GameStop, and I picked up my Persona 3 FES edition, and of course I think at that time I had just gotten the standard sort of case, GameStop case, and it just had the instruction manual in the game. And I was blown away by how wonderful that game is. And, this is, again, I'm sure there are people who imported the original Megami Tensei, Shin Megami Tensei games, who played the first Persona, and so they're going to say, oh, you're a noob, you sort of came along when everyone else did. But yeah, but it was a fundamentally terrific experience, and I was kind of thinking to myself, it was one of the last games that I kind of picked up from GameStop, and was truly, it felt like I had something special, I had something different, that I went through the stacks there, and I found something that was unique. It's not to say it's the last good game I got from GameStop. I think I got Mario Kart Wii U from GameStop, so, but it was still at a time where, and kind of really at the end of the era where you could actually still find, unique Japanese-style games, in a large chain store. So what was so great about Persona 3 for me was, the aesthetic, the opening anime, the music. The music was just, it was different. It was real pitch perfect for what the series was going for. And what really stood out was the fact that it did something fundamentally different and interesting with the standard RPG battle system. And I've always said that, rather than coming up with new and convoluted systems for battles and RPGs, I always think that the turn-based battle system is the best. I talked about this on the last podcast. And, this gave you the group combat. It gave you a reason to kind of talk to the NPCs and explore the world, so you can build your social links, upgrade your personas. It was different. It made you engage with the story because you always wanted to go back to that fun battle system. Now, you could sort of scan for weaknesses. I can't remember what the character was. That you found the weakness, and then you can get the extra hits and stuff like that. Also carried forward in Persona 4. And I really like the story of, the midnight hour. I thought it was a great kind of evocative story. Now, this is not to say the game is perfect. I'm sure people are pointing out that, yes, it is extremely linear. It is just basically a grindy sort of tower climb. I get that, but the combat and the, whatever you want to call it, the overworld, the Japanese, high school setting was very, very engaging because your actions in there, kind of affected how well you could perform and you know, how much farther you could take, you know, the climb of the tower, you know, in the combat mode. So really found myself pouring a lot of time into that, and, you know, kind of happy in a way that I was still using my PlayStation 2. And, you know, I think back now on really having purchased a lot of JRPGs since then, and the kind of, I don't know what you would want to call it, this desire to have these slice of life games, you know, just to, hey, I'm in a Japanese high school setting, you know, because I think that's cool in and of itself. I never found that. I never found, you know, being a high school student in Japan to be a particularly compelling kind of experience that I wanted to, you know, live, you know, vicariously through a game. But I think what Persona did was, again, it made that setting relevant by virtue of the battle system and of the leveling system for your different Persona. So, you know, fast forward to Persona 4, of course, pick that up, and I actually had to pick up a complete in-box copy of Persona 3 just so I could have, excuse me, you know, that sitting on my shelf. And Persona 4, obviously, from a narrative standpoint, of course, a stronger game. I wasn't so much a fan of the setting. I didn't think the whole, you know, jump into the television kind of world was as evocative as the Midnight Hour, but still a tremendous game, tremendous music, put a lot of time into that. I still haven't finished it due to my own idiocy. I would say played through half of it on the PlayStation 2, and then when Persona 4 Golden came out, played through to about 75% of the story. Then I decided to, I can't remember if it was I made a mistake backing it up, or I switched the accounts that were tied to my memory card. Because I think the deal was that, you know, I was using my Japanese account, and I wanted to use my American account for some reason. It may have been around the time that the PlayStation 4 came out, and I wanted to do the streaming or something. Anyway, whatever the case was, I was like, oh, I'm just going to switch my account so I can play my games and go back and forth between the two accounts like I did on the PlayStation 3, like I do on the PlayStation 4, like I did on the PS3. Well, apparently that deleted all of your saves, and I have not really gone back. I shouldn't say that. I've tried to, you know, get back into it, but I just don't know if I can put through a third, you know, playthrough with all the other stuff that I want to play. Anyway, absolutely brilliant games, and you know, of course, it forced me to look into the other games that Atlus was putting out, and I think in that time between, let's say, 2007 till roughly the present, Atlus has just been churning out really great games in the Shin Megami Tensei and the Persona series. You know, I played a little bit of Digital Devil Saga. Not a huge fan of that. Went back, though, to Persona 1 and Persona 2. Persona 2, first part of that, PSP. Second part of that, I guess you could play on the PSP, but I have it on the PlayStation 3. And, you know, those were great games. Things like Soul Hackers, just a great, you know, again, just a wonderful setting, wonderful music, great art, not only in the Saturn version, but also in the 3DS version. The Devil Summoner series, you know, absolutely incredible. The two games on the 3DS, which I'm blanking on, are they Devil Summoner, or I'm getting them confused. Devil Summoner may have been, well, of course you had, the Devil Summoner Soul Hackers, and then, why am I blanking on the Devil Survivor, rather. So Devil Survivor, kind of the strategy RPG of the two of those released on the DS, the 3DS. And they did the Etrian Odyssey games, which I'm not a, you know, huge fan of. Code of Princess, and as I said, the Shin Megami Tensei 4, Legend of Legacy, which I think they published, but I have to get into that. I have that, have not opened it. So really just a stretch of these really niche but fundamentally interesting Oh, I forgot Dark Spire. Dark Spire on the DS. Anyway, so these fundamentally, interesting niche games, and I think you have to appreciate a developer who's taking the risk to do that, to bring these out and really expanding the market and translating these games for the North American market. It's, I think, a really great story. And, I go back to, like, Working Designs. They were the company that was doing that when I was a kid, and I think Atlus has, in a way, taken up that legacy. And also, because of, I think, their success, you're seeing Exceed, Gaijin Works, Axis, so we're really in this, spoiled by choice kind of a situation where a lot of these niche titles are coming out. We can finally play them. They're getting translated on a, I think a fairly consistent basis. If I were to be negative, I would say that the games themselves are not as interesting as the kind of games you saw in the 90s and early 2000s, but nonetheless, I really do think you have to support these companies because, we live in a time when, very little is actually different in video games, right? I mean, everyone around the world roughly plays the same handful of games, on the large scale, but then if you, go beneath that, you really do see these examples of cultural difference, of kind of games that, are out of the comfort zone and make you feel like, you have a cultural product with which, you're not immediately familiar and that you kind of have to get into. And I think that's one of the nice things about video games is that, they're not just creating worlds internally, but they kind of open your eyes to a different part of this world. And I think if a game does both of that at the same time, like the Persona games, I think it's all the more fascinating. So, can we kind of put them up there with Squaresoft, Nintendo, Sega, Konami of olds? I don't know. I think they're really making a push. And, I think also, I probably should mention this, if you look at their business history, they were constantly, bought out by different companies. Now they're owned by Sega. And despite that I guess, they've always operated kind of independently, even when they were purchased by all these different companies. One of the articles said that, think of them like Blizzard within Activision today. And I think that's probably an apt analogy. They have continued to put out quality products, and I think the next step would be for them to breathe some life into some of Sega's franchises. I think that's kind of the ultimate wish that a lot of us had, was like, let's take Atlus's innovation and also their ability to translate and get some, new takes on Sega games, or actually translate some games. Like one thing that I've always wanted to play, and I think would make a great 3DS game, is that Sega Gaga thing at the end of the Dreamcast. I know some people imported that, but, of course, all in Japanese. I think it would be wonderful if Atlus said, hey, give us the code, we're going to translate that and release it on the 3DS. Really looking forward to that. Hoping that they can lend their translation and localization prowess to the Yakuza game, so we get them, within 6 months of their Japanese releases. And then also, of course, looking forward to Persona 5, which I guess is coming out on the PS3, if I'm not mistaken, this December. I'm not seeing a release date, but maybe they're going to do it for the Persona 5. They're also bringing it to the PlayStation 4. So, looking forward to the continuation of that series and kind of taking it to the next level. And I really hope that they, don't fall prey to the crazy DLC and half-finished games sort of business practices that we see today that, like Persona 3, like Persona 4, they really take their time and release an absolutely amazing, completed game that transports you to, I'm going to say it again, an evocative and different and absorbing world. So, congratulations to Atlus, and, let's hope that the success story continues. Okay, for a while now, I've wanted to do, on my YouTube channel, a segment called This Month in Gaming, where I go back in the history of gaming, my personal history, and then a little bit farther back and a little bit farther ahead than what I consider my golden years, and really look at the releases that came out in a given month. So I figured, since kind of transitioning to the podcasting format, that would be a good podcasting segment. And one of the things that I found, particularly when you go back into the 80s and even earlier, and actually also into the 90s, is that it's very hard to find, listings of game releases by month. If you sort of look at this and look at all the databases online, the best you can get is usually just a year, and then you have to kind of go and really do some sleuthing. So I said, okay, the first, since May is coming up, the first month that I want to look at is May of 1989. And I wanted to do this for a few reasons. First, I think if you look back on that famous quote, I think it was it Dick Clark or Casey Kasem? I don't know, where he said, pop music or, music is the soundtrack to your life. I think, to a degree, you can look back on different times in your gaming life, and you really have sort of pleasant memories associating, games with particular periods in your life, and also particular seasons. And May was always one of my favorite gaming seasons. When I was a kid, my parents had a very strict rule, and that was you cannot play video games at all, every day until your homework was done. And, if I broke that rule, the games would disappear. So, during the school year, I, could only sort of, binge play, if you want to call it that, Christmas and other sort of breaks and on weekends. But then again, you still got homework over the weekends. So there really wasn't, during the school year, a lot of time for, that kind of binge play mentality. But I always saw May as the point where, I could see that on the horizon. It always seemed like, especially towards the end of the month, things were dying down a little bit at school. The homework, particularly later on in high school and things like that, began to drop off a little bit. And I had, on a daily basis, a little bit more time to play games. And you couple, with that, having grown up in the Northeast, the weather is finally starting to improve. And so that spring feel is in the air. You have the anticipation for summer and being able to game in summer. And by the way, I guess it's very different for kids nowadays, but when it was summer for us, it was a break. It was, 2 months of more or less idleness and more or less 2 months of the ability to sort of pursue whatever it was that you wanted to pursue. And for me, that was, of course, gaming. Maybe you did a summer camp for 1 or 2 weeks or a program for 2 or 3 weeks, but it was typically local. And of course, then you did the family vacation, but that never lasted more than a week or 2 in my case. And of course, then, I could still bring along the Game Boy, or I could spend time in the arcades. So, there really wasn't a ton of structured time in the summer. I guess now it's totally different, where the kids are sort of programmed to do all of these different things, and camps, and school, and test prep, and all of that. But, with that expanse of time in the summer, that was my time to game, and some of the best gaming that I've ever done in my life. And, that's not just in hindsight, but just as, it's not the rosy glasses of nostalgia, but it was really, and again, I'm thinking here, it's hard to remember back when you were sort of a young kid, but definitely in high school and things like that, playing through Final Fantasy over the summer, Metal Gear Solid, really great games, and a solid amount of time, no pun intended, to play them. And then sort of the little quirks of memory that suddenly become kind of important as you get older. I remember, in addition to this anticipation, in addition to sort of, maybe having an extra half hour a night to play games, or not so much homework on the weekends, where I could really devote the weekends to games and, back certainly around the time of 1989, renting NES games, we didn't have central air. So towards the mid to end of May, my father would put in, like in every room, those window air conditioners. And for whatever reason, I loved those window air conditioners. It just, when they went in, it just felt like, summer and free time was around the corner. I could set it as cold as I wanted to. I found the humming to be relaxing. And of course, with that exchange of, outside air coming into the room, you could kind of like smell, the freshly cut grass and kind of the different scents of spring and summer. And just kind of that smell and the feel of that air and playing the games just is incredibly nostalgic to me. And I chose this. I was going to do 1989, May of 1989, A, for the May nostalgia, then B, because I think 1989 is, for me, the year where I really became conscious of video games, as an industry, as kind of a continuum of products, from different companies. Before that, I certainly played video games before that. I was definitely playing arcade games and really enjoying that, but it was kind of, an isolated experience, or I'd, go over to a friend's house and, play their NES. I didn't have an NES of my own at the time. So, 89, May of 89, I had finally, I got my Nintendo. So obviously that's a big deal. And I was able to sort of play a lot of the releases prior to that. And it's just, I remember, did I have Nintendo Power in 89? I don't know when the first Nintendo Power came out. I think it was 88. So I probably was reading Nintendo Power in 89. I don't remember EGM, like the May 89 issue, although I'm going to draw on it for this segment. But yeah, it was kind of the time where I said, it's not just Nintendo, there's some other companies. So I figured I'd start there. And of course, herein lies the problem. Very difficult, very, very difficult to find good information about what games were actually released in May of 89. I tried the Moby Games database. That only gives you a year. There's another video game database called vidgame.info, I believe, and they break it out sort of by system and manufacturer, and they have just a few release dates for May of 89, and then they had a whole bunch that said release date unknown. So I figured I'd go to EGM, and of course 89, the inaugural year of EGM, May-June, the inaugural issue. But, as I looked through that issue, I noticed some problems. They had a preview section, so they previewed actually a lot of games, and they said coming out in April or March or April. And of course, it was the May issue, or the May/June issue. So, a lot of their previews were out, and I kind of, and of course my memory could be failing me, but I kind of remember them being in the stores, being up for rent in 89, May of 89, and into the summer of 89. So it's kind of an inexact kind of segment, I guess, in that sense. I'm going off of memory and then this fundamentally kind of incomplete set of information, but I think it's as good as you can get for this time period. Now, obviously, I'm not going to go in chronological order. I'm not going to do, the next, July of 89. I'm just going to sort of pick, at random, different years corresponding to whatever month we're doing, and sort of look at the games that came out. So, as I sort of thumb through, just accessing the list here, all the previews and reviews that were in this 89 issue, it's kind of interesting. Nothing stands out as being fundamentally great. You have some good games, have some very nostalgic games that aren't very good, but 1989 was one of my favorite years in gaming because it was a transitional year, and a significant transitional year. If you consider, we were just about to kind of get into the 16-bit era. And if you look at this issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly, obviously it's the first issue, and it's right before we get a lot of serious information on the 16-bit consoles, and of course the release of the Genesis, of the TurboGrafx-16, I guess later in that year. They actually have a sort of a little rumors and kind of blurb segment really looking at those consoles plus the Super Famicom. But yeah, this is firmly rooted in the NES era, for better or for worse. And it's hard to determine what was out and what they called a preview but was out. And of course they were reviewing some stuff that had been out for a while, so we're just gonna take it as it comes and see what we can do with the list. I guess I'll start by looking at the games for which I have firm release dates comparing, or at least release months, comparing these various sources. And one is the Tengen version of Tetris. Now, the Tengen version of Tetris, I guess this was, put in that special cart to circumvent Nintendo's monopolistic policies. I want to say it was, kind of one of the articles that they displayed in that famous Nintendo Atari court case. I don't know that I ever played this version, because I think, they had a Nintendo licensed version of Tetris, if I'm not mistaken, on the NES. But I sort of recall, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, send me a tweet if I'm wrong about this, but there was a Tengen Tetris in the arcades, which I have played, and is actually a really, really good game. To a certain extent, a little bit more colorful, a little bit more of the kind of Russian onion dome theme to it than what I remember on the NES. And of course, the majority of Tetris I played was on the Game Boy. Then they have Operation Wolf, which is a game I actually have not played. I've never played Operation Wolf, but I take it's sort of a kind of run and gun, kind of Akari Warrior style game. So those are the only two games I can really say, based on looking at a couple of sources, were really released in May of '89. So obviously that's kind of a limiting list. But let's take a look at some of the other games that they reviewed as coming out then. Again, firmly rooted in the NES era here. 1943 for the NES, Racket Attack, Ultima Exodus, Bubble Bobble, Bump and Jump. Now, they also reviewed Tecmo Bowl versus John Elway's Quarterback. Of course, Tecmo Bowl came out in '87, so I'm going to leave that off. Hard Drivin' came out in the arcade. That's the Atari, almost like 3D-esque arcade game, which I remember really, really loving. I had it on the Genesis, and just taking that little 3D-style car through these roller coaster loops and seeing it crash was incredibly entertaining as a kid. But really can't say that it's very enjoyable these days. Now, they list Double Dragon having come out on the Commodore 64, and they've got some screenshots in here. It actually looks like a fairly decent game. At least, again, I never had a Commodore 64, but going by the screenshots, looked fairly graphically impressive for the time, better than the NES version. Now, I played a lot of Double Dragon on the NES, and, thought it was okay, but I recently, a couple of years ago, I picked it up for the Master System, and I really like that version, so it'll be interesting to see if this Commodore 64 exceeded the Master System version. I can't say that I played Bubble Bobble, Bump and Jump, or Ultima Exodus, or 1943 for that matter, although I've gained an appreciation for that whole 1943 series. They list Rastan and Ease as having come out for the Master System in this May-June of '89 time frame. Now, I have not played Ease on the Master System. I believe that's just the Book 1, but that's a really, really nice game to have out. I mean, and Rastan, of course, kind of a classic arcade game. So I would say, that's actually a strong kind of lineup for the Master System. But then we're going to take a look at some of the other games they reviewed, and a lot of these games I remember renting. And again, this is going to be, this is going to be my memory, going off of memory here. Were they released in 89? I don't really know, but I certainly rented them shortly after getting my NES in 89, so I'm just going to go for it. And I'm going to start off with an abysmal game, a terrible game, and yet one that I loved as a kid, and that was WWF Wrestlemania, the original Wrestlemania, that sort of side view, horribly controlling abomination. But you know what? It had the theme music, it had Hulk Hogan on the screen. I played it for hours. I don't know that I owned it. I think I just rented it a lot. I had the follow-ups to it, which kind of had the isometric view. But I went and I played this actually last summer for for my series on the best. Well, I guess maybe this was released in 1990 then, because I think that video was Best Games of 90 or something. Or maybe not. Maybe I talked about it in some other context. But I played it for one of my videos, and it was terrible. Hard to pin, hard to move, very, very limiting move sets. Punch, kick, slam, basically for each wrestler. And then you could kind of do, so if you were the Macho Man, you can do an elbow. If you were the Bam Bam Bigelow, you could kind of do the headbutt. And they had their little power-up icons floating in the back. Just bad. But, boy, was I thrilled to get to be able to play that game after I got my NES. And then a couple of other, what I would say, kind of bad games, but that similarly like WrestleMania show what I would call the ascendancy of the license. The NES was, I think, really one of the first systems where it didn't take a ton of imagination to really buy into the license. What do I mean by that? Well, the WWF game, those characters looked enough like WWF wrestlers where it felt like, oh, I just watched WrestleMania 4, now I'm playing as these guys, this is great. Whereas I remember, with Atari, you really had to kind of stretch your imagination a little bit, like look at the E.T. game, where, this block of pixels was E.T., and he was going around, or I think there was a Star Wars game, very similar, but the NES was one of the first consoles that had the visual fidelity where, if the game looked like a cartoon version of the license, it was pretty good. And so another game, Magic Johnson's Fast Break Basketball, which they have listed in here as coming out in 89, around this time. Bad game. I mean, it wasn't as good as Double Dribble, but it had Magic Johnson, and he was my favorite basketball player. And while I did not have the license, I guess, for the NBA, it was Magic Johnson in a yellow uniform, and he could do all the passes and the dunks, and that was good enough for a couple rentals. Hoops was the same way. Hoops had a guy that looked like Isaiah Thomas on the cover, so I rented that game, and it was, if I remember correctly, that one I haven't played in a long, long time, but it was more of a kind of like a, one-on-one or three-on-three kind of blacktop type basketball game. Not very good. Then they have here, where is it? Paperboy. Now, Paperboy is a game that I really, really liked, and that I rented a lot, and I thought, wow, this game controls so beautifully. This is one of the best games I've ever played, and that stuck in my mind for a while. A couple of years ago, bought the Paperboy for the NES, and it doesn't control as well as I thought, but still a lot of fun to play. The fact that you could randomly generate those, the different houses and neighborhoods, or at least seemingly so, it was and felt like an innovation, and I definitely have memories of cranking up that air conditioner to the coldest possible setting and sitting in there and playing Paperboy. Again, was it May of 89? who can say really, but it was in '89 after I got my Nintendo. Now, they're going to list DuckTales here, and I thought DuckTales was released in 90, but maybe it was 89, because I guess the cartoon was fairly popular, I guess, in the late 80s, but had a lot of fun with that. That is really one of the better NES games, hard as nails, but it was Capcom, at their NES pinnacle, and ton of fun. So those are the games that I have memories with. Now, they're saying Mega Man 2. I could have sworn Mega Man 2 was 88. They have Metal Gear Solid. Again, I thought that was Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear, the original Metal Gear, 88. Skater Die, 88. Again, all games I rented and enjoyed, although I kind of question whether these were not just added in there for the heck of it. I think Metal Gear was 90. I'll dispense with the frantic typing here, because I know that doesn't necessarily sound so great on the podcast. So those are kind of the games that stood out to me. And again, it's right before we get into that interesting transition, 8-bit to 16-bit. Just exciting times. I mean, and we haven't really had, by the way, a lot of exciting transitional periods, I would say, and they've gotten less noteworthy as time has gone on. Think back to 93, 94, when you had the birth of the 32-bit era with, excuse me, the Jaguar, the 3DO, the Laser Active, the PlayStation on the horizon. It felt like anything was really, Amiga CD, anything was possible. There's that great sense of possibility. When the N64 came out and the 32-bit era really took shape between Sega, Nintendo, Sony. Again, another kind of fascinating period. But then after that, I don't know, to me the Dreamcast, PlayStation 2 era didn't have that kind of visceral sense of excitement. And although significant for because of the inclusion of DVD, Sega, being Sega's last console, but I think that was, I don't know, I just didn't have that feel like, oh my god, the 16-bit era coming out, or the 32-bit era. It sort of lost a little something. And since then, I don't know that we've really had, I actually think, and I've talked about this in the last podcast, that the exciting transitional moment, after, wherever you want to place the excitement in the 32-bit, or the release of the PlayStation 2 and the death of the Sega Dreamcast. I think now, with VR, we are in actually an exciting transitional moment. It's going to be very interesting to see how that played out. But, so I just, I think, like I said, we'll take other years and other podcasts, but certainly very, very nostalgic, looking at these sources, accuracy aside, and seeing a lot of the games, and just something about the NES, the sound of the NES, the graphics, and that time of year, and then certainly into the summer. Just tremendous, tremendous memories. And I know I certainly, as you could feel spring in the air of '89, I was gearing up really for my first, big, consistent gaming summer.
Everything's set for tonight, Mr. Trump. I wonder what Trump's game is this time. Trump's got a new game. Trump's got a new deal. What's your game, Donald? Heard about Trump's new deal? What? Trump has a new game. What is it? Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump, please. My new game is Trump, the game.
Trump, the game where you deal for everything you've ever wanted to own. Because it's not whether you win or lose, it's whether you win.
Yes!
Play Trump, the game from Milton Bradley.
I think you'll like it.
Alright, it is time for games of the month, and I've got 2 games for you. I thought I would have more, but as I explained in the open, I'm releasing this episode a little bit early, so I'm going to talk about 2. And the first one is a game that I discovered out of nowhere. One night I happened to be on YouTube, and I saw a comment come in on the video I did on the Taito Legends 2 disc for the PlayStation 2, and the guy said, "Oh, thanks for doing this review. This was my game back in the PlayStation 2 era. I absolutely love it. So I said, I haven't even thought about that video in a while. Let me pop that in. And I haven't played, or I guess I haven't played. Obviously, I haven't played every game on there because I didn't play or discover this one until that night. And it's a game called Cameltry. Yes, camel the animal, try the verb, all one word. And basically, what this game is a 2D Super Monkey Ball. You have this marble, and you control the geography of the stage, almost like the bonus levels in the very first Sonic game for the Genesis. And so you're shifting the stage around and having your ball sort of bounce around and avoiding obstacles. Some of the obstacles will just kind of hold you up, like these little almost pachinko pins that you can get stuck on. Other times you'll hit these, what for lack of a better term, I guess are mines, and you hit them and you lose time. And each level has a specific time limit. Now sometimes there are bonuses where you can gain time back, and you just shift the level around and very carefully manipulate the ball to the goal. And it's very, very simple, but a ton of fun. And it's the kind of game that I would have loved to play in the arcades back in the day. I don't remember seeing it at all. It's very simple. It has 4 areas, we'll call them. I'm going to say levels because each area is broken up into a number of levels, but they have a kind of a training mode and then easy, moderate, and advanced. And it's just fun. It's good music. Each playthrough, kind of as you're sort of building your skill with this game, you can really, really cut down on your time and memorize the patterns and get to the point where the ball is almost in the center of the screen, and you're moving, like I said, the geography of the screen around so precisely that the ball just stays in the center, and you're just shifting the screen around and getting to the goal. And I could only do that on some of the earlier levels. The other ones I had to play again and again to memorize the patterns. There's also tempting power-ups sort of right off the beaten path that are really going to test your skill to get to them. An absolutely terrific game. So, it's 2D, essentially, Super Monkey Ball. And it was released apparently on a number of different platforms. I believe on the Super Nintendo, it was called On the Ball by Taito. I think it was released on smartphones a couple of years ago as well. But just a ton of fun. And it's the type of game that in the arcade would seem to, I think, at least in the late 80s, early 90s when it came out, I think it would really kind of be one of those great games where you could sort of play on it as you were waiting for something else. I've talked about this a number of different times. For me, that was always pinball. It was actually a lot of the Neo Geo games I was waiting to get on Street Fighter. So a strange name, but I think kind of a sleeper hit on that collection. And it took me back to, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but there was a Taito arcade game, and I don't know what it is called. It has something to do with beer. And basically it's this vertical playing field of different holes, and you control a metal rod, and you slide this ball on the rod and sort of move it up as far as you can go, knocking it into the different holes, and seeing how you could sort of do that in a certain amount of time. Very, very challenging game. Obviously physics-based game. Really takes a lot. And again, this is not a video game. This is actually a mechanical device, but it was in a number of arcades when I was a kid, and I've seen it in some retro arcades that I've been to as I've traveled. So Taito's on there. It's called something King or something like that, but it looks like a big glass of beer with all these little holes in it. So I think this Cameltry kind of reminded me of that game. It's not going to entertain you for longer than a half hour, but it's a good sort of sit back, relax, have a drink, and unwind game. Plays very, very well, obviously on the PlayStation 2. I'm not sure that it's super expensive if you can get it on the Super Nintendo, and of course I would imagine it's floating around MAME if you want to try it that way. Now the next game that I wanted to discuss, and that I played for a night or two this month, is Sonic Generations. And Sonic Generations excited me when it came out. I love the idea of a new 2D side-scrolling Sonic game, and I probably picked it up on release or shortly after release. And I remember the reviews being somewhat mixed, and I was angry about that because finally we're getting back to what Sonic should be about. Well, I played through it on the PC, and the PC port is, I think, absolutely superb. If you have a powerful PC, just crisp, smooth, 60 frames per second. So I wanted to go back to it, but for whatever reason, it would no longer launch. This is on the old PC. So I had it also for the PlayStation 3, so I kicked it on the PlayStation 3. Not as great an experience, honestly, on the PlayStation 3. But let's just talk about the game. Was it really a letdown? I'm still going to say that it's not, even though there are some major problems with it. You know, Sonic hasn't aged well for a lot of people. You have two camps. One camp is going to say the 2D Sonic games were never that good. They were never at the level of a Mega Man or Mario. The speed trick was just there to, get you through the levels as quickly as possible, and it didn't take a lot of precision. I agree that it's not as finely tuned as a lot of the great 2D platformers of the time, but I don't think it was trying to be. I think Sonic was trying very hard to be something different, to be this really engaging and exciting and bold visual experience that those other games were not. And so that's where the speed comes in, the verticality of the levels, the big bold sprites. I think that was deliberate, and I think it was successful. So I wouldn't want Sonic to change, and I think the Sonic Generations, the 2D Sonic levels, are all very, very good, incredibly lush, incredibly detailed, lots of stuff to discover. They basically gave me everything I wanted out of that type of level. Are they as good as the Sonic 4 games that have come out on I guess the Xbox One, on the PlayStation 3, and I guess smartphones and whatever else? I like them. I have to say, I realize that maybe the Sonic 4 games are more popular, but I like them all, and I think these are really, really solid levels. Of course, the problem is that there aren't that many of them, and you have to play the 3D Sonic levels to progress through the game, and that's the weak point of the Sonic series, and of course of this game. And I've always been torn on 3D Sonic. It should be a great idea, but they really did keep to pushing you with that speed burst through the levels, and as a result you don't have a lot of control. I think that's the problem with this game. As gorgeous as these 3D levels are, and they really are gorgeous, the control is borderline abysmal. As you're sort of blasting through at high speed, you have some really great sequences, like, I'm blanking on the name of the city stage, but when the truck is chasing you with its sort of knives and grinders and blades and stuff like that. Amazing sequence when the whale's chasing you in the first one. It looks great. But then you have these other moments where it seems to be forcing you into some precise jumps, but you come upon the jumps so quickly and the control is so off, you can never really land with any accuracy. And it leads to a lot of frustration. And that's what I experienced on this PlayStation 3 playthrough that I did. And then, of course, you have the baffling and persistent need of whoever creates the Sonic games now to include a narrative, and to have that narrative include all of these different characters that no one cares about. When I was a kid, you had Sonic. Sonic 2, you have Tails. It allowed a second player to play the game. He could help Sonic out. Great. In 3, you had obviously the introduction of Knuckles, and okay, you have a meaner, bolder-looking Sonic thing, and it punches, and it, he can soar and latch onto things and climb up. Great. It needed to end there. I mean, there are characters in this game, they're so irritating. The little orb that talks to you, the different characters you unlock as you beat the different levels, and the cutscenes, and the chirpy anime voices. It is quite frankly sickening, and it's always, to me, been that way. I don't need Sonic to talk. I don't need a narrative to make a Sonic game good. Just focus on solid 3D gameplay, which they've never done, to my knowledge, and I think you would have a winner. I think there are still a lot of people that appreciate what Sonic was going for, and the aesthetic that has been maintained, it's just mechanically, it's just gone downhill. And I found this to be the case with whatever the Sonic game was that was released on the Wii U. Lost World, was it? Yeah, it's just that I found that one to be brutal for the same reasons. It just did not control very well. So what I've done is I've heard a lot of people talk pretty highly about Sonic Colors as being a really good 3D Sonic game. So I ordered that, found that online for a fairly cheap price. So I'm going to give that a go and see if that really is the 3D Sonic game we've been looking for. But Sonic Generations, I would kind of cautiously recommend it if you're a Sonic fan. It's probably dirt cheap. I mean, it appears on the Steam sales for, a couple bucks. And for that, it really is worth it, especially for the quality presentation on the PC. By the way, Sega games have always been great on the PC, even going all the way back to Rally Evo. Anyway, so those are your 2 games for this month. Cameltry, which I really encourage you to try if you can find it out there, even just find it on MAME, a really creative game with just an odd title that didn't become very popular. And Sonic Generations, a flawed attempt at a modern Sonic game, but one that still evokes nostalgia and has some pretty enjoyable side-scrolling 2D platforming levels. And we will bring this episode of the Retro Critical Podcast to a close with listener questions. And this is a segment that I'd really like to do on every podcast. If you want to send in a question, you can do it via Twitter. It is at game_escape_. And I'll put that in the show notes. So capital G, capital E there. And of course you can check the YouTube channel. You can check my website, thegameescape@wordpress.com. You can find me on a number of different formats. So this month's question comes from @TrueBoltman, and Chris. Chris is a long-time viewer on the channel, and have had a lot of good interactions with him. And he asks, did I ever enjoy the Nintendo Wii? And this goes back to some comments that I made on the channel about never really getting into the Wii. So, Chris, I would have to say I have gained an appreciation for the Wii, but I don't enjoy it in the same way I enjoy a lot of the other consoles in the game room. So, I got the Nintendo Wii very, very late in its life cycle. I want to say 2011 or 2012. And the reason I got it was because I was going out with this girl, and it was her favorite system, and I've gone out with her ever since, and we enjoy playing, well, she enjoys more than I do, but whatever, we both enjoy, we both have good memories playing Smash Brothers and Mario Kart. And so before the Wii U, this was her favorite system, and she was really loved those games. It was just something fun to do. So I figured, okay, well, the first time we played, I hadn't played a Mario Kart game since, I hate to say it, but probably, no, since the GameCube, because I did have the version on the GameCube, although I didn't play it that much, and I was embarrassed, so I was like, okay, I'm getting a Wii, and I'm going to at least, defend my manhood here, because I got absolutely trounced, and I got a little bit better, and so it was a nice hobby that we could, or at least aspect of the hobby that we could both share. Now, I was tempted just to leave it at that, but over the years, I have picked up some other games. Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, which I reviewed last summer, is a really standout game. I think a lot of people don't realize how significant that game is in the resurgence of the fighting genre, because remember, that game came out in North America anyway, actually in Japan, and then also in North America before the big Street Fighter IV resurgence. And it was experimenting with a lot of the ideas that would later take hold in Street Fighter IV, Street Fighter V, Marvel vs. Capcom. So that was a terrific game. And what else have I played on there that I've really liked? I mean, the Donkey Kong game was good. The Donkey Kong Country Returns, or whatever it's called. I never really got into the Virtual Console. I did pick up Xenoblade, whatever the Xenoblade game was on that. I couldn't really get into that one. I just didn't have the time, so I had picked up the whole trilogy, and I haven't really played the trilogy. I liked Mario Galaxy. I did get into that. But I think at the end of the day, the Wii never lost its reputation, or at least my perceived, or the reputation that I gave it way back when, as a kind of gimmicky console. Of all the Nintendo consoles out there, I don't like the Wiimote. I don't like the nunchuck. I just want a normal controller in my hand, and I want to sit back and play video games, play Nintendo, like I did when I was a kid. So I can kind of do that on the Wii U. Can't really do it on the Wii, but as I mentioned earlier in the episode, I am having this nostalgia for gaming between 2006 and 2012, so I could see myself still collecting for it. One of the games that I want to get is the Sakura Wars game, which I have on the PlayStation 2, and I have not opened it just because I haven't gotten to it, but I kind of want to leave that sealed, and maybe I can try it out on the Wii. So I guess my best Wii memory would be that my girlfriend organized, she was part of this charity organization, and she was doing an event with some local kids, and she set up a Wii tournament. We played, I think, Smash Brothers one day and Mario Kart the next, and so I was there with her, and we were playing against these kids and different teams and stuff like that. It was just an enjoyable experience. It has nothing to do with the hardware itself, I guess, but it was just, you just associate it with this really nice time that we had out there in the community, and it was a lot of fun. So the cool thing was, for that particular event, it was easy to do because all the kids had the Wiimotes, and so they just showed up, and they linked them up to the system, and we had a nice, shot it up there on a big projector, had it on the side of a wall in a gymnasium, and it was a lot of fun. So that's kind of my best Wii memory. But yeah, that's the relationship I have with it, and can't say that it's my favorite. I would probably rank it, as far as all the Nintendo consoles, honestly, for me, just above the Virtual Boy. But hey, it made Nintendo a lot of money, and its success, I think, has contributed to Nintendo being able to still be experimental and try new things out. So happy that that period in gaming occurred, but ultimately it is still not the Nintendo system for me. So that's going to do it here for the Retro Critical Podcast. As I said, I'll be back in May at some point with the third episode. Thanks for listening.